She always shows up unannounced, sometimes with a silly excuse, other times with a look that breaks through any defenses. She's 19, lives just downstairs, and knows exactly how to drive the lonely businessman in the penthouse insane. He swears he can resist, calls her trouble with clenched fists and a trembling voice, but every time she crosses that door, his self-control slips a little more, until one kiss changes everything, and there's no turning back. The elevator climbed to the penthouse with a soft hum that did nothing to calm Charlotte's racing heart. At 19, she had perfected the art of looking innocent while plotting mischief, and today's mission required both skills in abundance. The small silver key in her palm felt warm from her nervous grip, a key that shouldn't exist, technically speaking, but had been pressed into her hands by a well-meaning cleaning lady who'd grown fond of her frequent visits to help with groceries. Charlotte Hayes adjusted her oversized Columbia University sweatshirt and took a steadying breath. The cleaning lady had mentioned that Mr. Blackwood kept spare keys for emergencies, and somehow Charlotte had convinced herself that running out of coffee constituted exactly such an emergency. It was a flimsy excuse, she knew, but it was also 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, which meant the insufferably punctual Alexander Blackwood would be finishing his workout in the private gym he'd had installed in his penthouse. The thought made her stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with the elevator's smooth ascent. Alexander Blackwood, successful businessman, her brother's best friend since law school, and the most infuriatingly attractive man she'd ever laid eyes on. At 32, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made boardrooms fall silent and competitors nervous. Charlotte had been nursing a secret crush on him since she was 16, back when he was just that serious guy David brings home for holidays. Now living in the apartment directly below his Manhattan penthouse while attending Columbia, she found herself with unprecedented access to the object of her long-standing fascination. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper, revealing the marble-floored foyer of Alexander's penthouse. Charlotte's breath caught, as it did every time she stepped into this space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, while expensive artwork adorned walls painted in sophisticated grays and whites. Everything about the space screamed wealth, taste, and a level of adult sophistication that made her feel both impressed and slightly intimidated. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. She padded across the cool marble in her fuzzy slippers, following the sound of rhythmic weights clanking from the direction of the gym. Through the glass doors, she could see him, Alexander in all his morning glory, sweat glistening on his broad shoulders as he executed perfect deadlifts. His dark hair was disheveled from exertion, and the concentrated expression on his angular face made something warm unfurl in Charlotte's chest. "Focus," she told herself sternly. "Coffee. You're here for coffee." She slipped past the gym toward the kitchen, hoping to grab what she needed and escape before he noticed her presence. The man had an uncanny ability to make her feel simultaneously brave and terrified, confident and clumsy. It was maddening. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design, all gleaming stainless steel and black granite that probably cost more than most people's cars. Charlotte opened several cabinets before finding the good stuff, premium Ethiopian coffee beans that smelled like heaven and probably cost more per pound than her textbooks. "Looking for something specific, or just conducting a general inventory of my kitchen?" The deep, slightly amused voice made Charlotte jump so violently that she nearly dropped the bag of coffee beans. She spun around to find Alexander leaning against the doorframe, a white towel draped around his neck and a sports bottle in his hand. Without his usual business attire, wearing only black gym shorts and a tank top that clung to his chest in all the right places, he looked less like the intimidating businessman she knew, and more like, well, like every fantasy she'd ever had about him. Coffee," she stammered, holding up the bag as evidence. "I ran out, and I have this huge exam today, and I know you always buy the good stuff, so I thought—" She trailed off, suddenly aware of how ridiculous she must look in her pajama shorts and oversized sweatshirt, her honey-blonde hair pulled into a messy bun. Alexander's dark eyes swept over her appearance, lingering just a moment too long on her bare legs before snapping back to her face. Charlotte caught the look and felt heat bloom in her cheeks. How exactly did you get in here, Charlotte? His voice was calm, but she detected an undercurrent of something that might have been amusement or annoyance. With Alexander, it was often hard to tell. The cleaning lady gave me a spare key, she admitted, lifting her chin defiantly. For emergencies. And coffee emergencies fall under that category? Absolutely. She clutched the bag to her chest like a shield. Especially when the exam is on international business law, and I've been studying for 3 days straight, and the corner store downstairs only has that terrible generic stuff that tastes like it was brewed in a gym sock. Despite himself, Alexander's mouth twitched into what might have been the beginning of a smile. International business law, That's David's specialty. David's not here to help, Charlotte said, then immediately wished she could take the words back. They sounded more petulant than she'd intended. Alexander pushed off from the doorframe and moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, mixed with the clean scent of exertion. Where is your brother, anyway? Tokyo. Some big corporate merger that'll keep him there for 3 weeks. Charlotte took an instinctive step backward, only to bump against the kitchen island. He said you might, that is, if I really needed help with school stuff. He told you to ask me for academic help. Alexander's eyebrows rose, and Charlotte couldn't tell if he was pleased or annoyed by this revelation. Not exactly. She bit her lower lip, a gesture that drew Alexander's attention immediately. He mentioned you were brilliant with international law, and that you'd probably help if I asked nicely. And is this you asking nicely? Alexander moved even closer, bracing one hand on the granite counter beside her hip. The position wasn't exactly threatening, but it was definitely intimate. Breaking into my apartment at 7 in the morning to steal my coffee. Charlotte's pulse hammered against her throat. This close, she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could count the individual droplets of sweat still clinging to his collarbone. I prefer to think of it as borrowing, without permission. I was going to leave a note. Were you now? His voice had dropped to a low murmur that made her stomach do interesting things. And what would this note have said? Something charming and apologetic. Charlotte tried for a light tone, but her voice came out slightly breathless. Maybe with a promise to pay you back. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he straightened abruptly, running the towel over his face and neck. When he emerged from behind the white terry cloth, his expression was carefully neutral again. Keep the coffee, he said, his tone businesslike once more. But Charlotte. Yes? Next time, use the front door like a normal person. The spare key is for actual emergencies. Charlotte nodded, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment in her chest. For a moment there, she'd thought, but no. Alexander was just being kind because she was David's little sister. Nothing more. Thank you, she said quietly, clutching the coffee bag. I really appreciate it. Good luck with your exam. She was halfway to the elevator when his voice stopped her again. Charlotte? She turned, hope fluttering stupidly in her chest. Yes? Alexander's dark eyes held hers for a moment that stretched too long to be casual. Try to get some actual sleep tonight. Those shadows under your eyes suggest you're pushing too hard. The unexpected concern in his voice made her breath catch. I will. See that you do. As the elevator doors closed between them, Charlotte caught a glimpse of Alexander still standing in his kitchen doorway, watching her leave with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Only when she was safely back in her own apartment did she allow herself to grin. Mission accomplished. She had her coffee, and more importantly, she'd managed to see Alexander Blackwood first thing in the morning, rumpled and sweaty and absolutely devastating. Best of all, she was pretty sure he'd been looking at her legs. Now she just needed to come up with another emergency for tomorrow. Charlotte had always prided herself on being a strategic thinker, a trait that served her well in her economics classes, and, as it turned out, in devising increasingly creative excuses to visit the penthouse upstairs. 3 days after the coffee incident, she discovered that Alexander conducted important video conferences from his home office, every Thursday at 10:30 sharp, which was why she was currently standing outside his door at 10:28, armed with her laptop and her most innocent expression. She knocked softly, then waited exactly 15 seconds before using the spare key. Experience had taught her that Alexander responded better to mild rule-breaking than outright defiance. At least, that's what she told herself as she slipped into the marble foyer. Alexander, she called out sweetly. I'm so sorry to bother you, but my internet is completely down and I have this huge assignment due at noon. She followed the sound of his deep voice toward the office, pausing just outside the open doorway. Through the glass, she could see him seated at his massive mahogany desk, wearing a crisp white dress shirt and a navy tie that brought out his eyes. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his expression was one of intense concentration as he discussed quarterly projections with what appeared to be a room full of executives via video conference. Charlotte took a steadying breath and knocked on the doorframe. Alexander's gaze snapped to her immediately, and she watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. But to his credit, and her surprise, he didn't miss a beat in his presentation. "Excuse me for just one moment, gentlemen," he said smoothly to the screen, then muted his microphone and turned to face her with raised eyebrows that clearly communicated this better be good. "I'm so sorry," Charlotte whispered, stepping into the office with her laptop clutched to her chest. "My internet crashed right in the middle of uploading my international economics paper, and it's due in 90 minutes, and I know you're busy. But David said in emergencies, your internet is down." Alexander's voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Completely dead. I called the building manager, but he said it might be hours before they can fix it." Charlotte bit her lip and tried to look appropriately distressed. "I know this is terrible timing, but if I could just use your Wi-Fi for like 20 minutes to upload the file." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as if looking for signs of deception. Charlotte held her breath, trying to project nothing but innocent academic panic. "The Wi-Fi password is Blackwood Capital, all one word, capital B and C," he said finally, his voice low enough not to carry to the microphone. "Thank you so much," Charlotte breathed, settling herself into the leather chair across from his desk. "I promise I'll be super quiet. You won't even know I'm here." Alexander's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement before he turned back to his conference, unmuting his microphone to resume his presentation on third-quarter growth projections. Charlotte opened her laptop and pretended to work frantically on her assignment, but in reality she was completely captivated by watching Alexander in his element. This was a side of him she'd never seen before, the commanding businessman who could discuss complex financial strategies while maintaining the kind of authoritative presence that made grown men hang on his every word. It was incredibly attractive. She tried to focus on her actual schoolwork, but every few minutes her gaze would drift back to Alexander, the way his long fingers moved as he gestured toward charts on his screen, the slight crease that appeared between his eyebrows when he concentrated, the unconscious way he loosened his tie as the meeting progressed. 20 minutes into the conference, Charlotte's laptop made a soft chime as she received an email. Alexander's eyes flicked to her immediately, and she mouthed sorry while quickly closing the notification. But the interruption seemed to break something in his concentration, because she noticed his gaze returning to her more frequently after that. "As you can see from the projected numbers," Alexander was saying, gesturing toward a complex graph, "we're looking at a 15% increase in market share by—" Charlotte chose that moment to cross her legs, the movement causing her sundress to ride up slightly on her thighs. She didn't do it on purpose, at least that's what she told herself, but she noticed immediately when Alexander's words faltered. "By the end of Q4, he continued, his voice slightly rougher than before. His eyes lingered on her legs for just a moment too long before snapping back to the screen. Interesting, Charlotte thought, fighting back a smile. She spent the next 10 minutes conducting subtle experiments, stretching her arms above her head in a way that lifted the hem of her dress, tucking a strand of honey-blonde hair behind her ear with deliberate slowness, chewing thoughtfully on the end of her pen while pretending to read her textbook. Each small movement earned her a brief but unmistakable glance from Alexander, and she watched with fascination as his legendary composure began to show tiny cracks. He stumbled over a statistic he'd clearly known by heart. His hand went to his tie twice in 5 minutes. When she bent forward to retrieve a pen she'd accidentally dropped, she heard him clear his throat roughly. "Gentlemen," Alexander said abruptly, cutting off a question about profit margins, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to continue this discussion via email. Something urgent has come up that requires my immediate attention." Charlotte's heart stuttered. Had she gone too far? After a round of polite goodbyes, Alexander closed the laptop and turned to face her fully. The intensity in his dark eyes made her stomach flutter. "Something urgent?" she asked innocently. "Yes." Alexander stood slowly, moving around the desk to lean against it directly in front of her chair. The position put him at eye level with her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her want to lean closer. "A certain brat seems to be under the impression that my home office is an appropriate place to conduct her academic emergencies." The word brat should have been insulting, but the way Alexander said it, low and slightly amused with just a hint of something warmer underneath, made Charlotte's pulse quicken instead. "I was being quiet," she protested, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "You said I could use the Wi-Fi." "I did. What I didn't say was that you could spend the entire time providing a rather distracting sideshow." Heat flooded Charlotte's cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Alexander's voice was dangerously soft. He leaned forward slightly, bracing his hands on the arms of her chair and effectively trapping her in place. "Let me be clearer, then. The next time you need to use my internet, Charlotte, I suggest you choose an outfit that's a little less likely to derail international business conferences." The accusation hung in the air between them, charged with intention that made Charlotte's breath catch. She was acutely aware of how close he was, of the way his dress shirt stretched across his broad chest, of the heat radiating from his body. "I'm wearing a perfectly respectable sundress," she said, proud that her voice came out steady despite the way her heart was racing. "Respectable is one word for it." Alexander's dark eyes dropped briefly to her bare legs, then back to her face. "Though I might choose differently." "How would you describe it?" The question slipped out before Charlotte could stop it, and she immediately wanted to take it back. She was playing with fire, and they both knew it. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something dangerous flickering in his expression. Then he straightened abruptly, putting distance between them. "I'd describe it as something that has no place in my office during business hours," he said, his voice carefully controlled once again. "Your assignment uploaded successfully, by the way. Your internet emergency has been resolved." The dismissal was clear, but Charlotte found herself reluctant to leave. Something had shifted in the last few minutes. Some invisible line had been approached, if not crossed, and she wasn't sure she was ready to pretend it hadn't happened. "Alexander," she began, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. "Yes? Thank you for letting me use your office. I know I interrupted something important." "Yes," he agreed quietly. "You did." But when Charlotte reached the door and turned back for one last look, she found Alexander still watching her, his dark eyes unreadable but intense. And despite his words about interruptions and inappropriate dresses, she was pretty sure she detected something that looked very much like reluctant appreciation in his gaze. As she waited for the elevator, Charlotte couldn't help but smile. Her internet was working perfectly, of course. It had been the entire time. But she'd learned something valuable today. Alexander Blackwood was not nearly as immune to her as he pretended to be. Now she just needed to figure out what to do with that information. The October rain had started as a light drizzle during Charlotte's morning literature class, but by the time she emerged from the Columbia Library at 4 in the afternoon, it had escalated into the kind of downpour that turned umbrellas inside out and sent even the most dedicated New Yorkers scrambling for cover. Most sane people would have waited it out in the warm, dry library. Charlotte, however, had spotted a golden opportunity. She'd deliberately left her umbrella at home that morning, a calculated risk that she'd been hoping would pay off all day. Now, standing in the library's entrance and watching the sheets of rain cascade down, she couldn't help but smile. The weather gods were clearly on her side. 20 minutes later, Charlotte stood outside Alexander's penthouse door, absolutely soaked to the skin. Her white cotton blouse clung transparently to her curves, her dark jeans were plastered to her legs, and her honey-blonde hair hung in damp waves around her shoulders. Water dripped steadily from her clothing onto the marble floor, creating a small puddle at her feet. Perfect. She knocked softly and waited, shivering just enough to be convincing but not enough to actually suffer. The sound of footsteps approached, and then the door swung open to reveal Alexander in dark slacks and a burgundy sweater that made his eyes look almost black in the hallway lighting. His expression went from mild curiosity to something much more complex the moment he saw her standing there, dripping and bedraggled in his doorway. "Jesus Christ, Charlotte." The words escaped him in a rough exhale, and she watched his gaze travel from her soaked hair down to her wet shoes, lingering noticeably on the way her blouse had become essentially see-through. "What the hell happened to you?" "Got caught in the rain," she said through chattering teeth that were only partially fake. "I was wondering if I could maybe use your bathroom to dry off a bit. I'm absolutely freezing." Alexander stared at her for another long moment, his jaw working like he was fighting some internal battle. Finally, he stepped aside to let her in. "Of course. Come in before you catch pneumonia." Charlotte stepped into the warm penthouse, acutely aware of the water dripping from her clothes onto his expensive flooring. "I'm so sorry about the mess. I didn't want to drip all over the elevator." "Don't worry about the floor," Alexander cut her off, his voice strangely tight. "Just stay right there for a second. Don't move." He disappeared down the hallway, leaving Charlotte standing in the foyer feeling suddenly self-conscious. The penthouse's air conditioning was making her acutely aware of just how transparent her clothing had become, and she crossed her arms over her chest in a belated attempt at modesty. Alexander returned a moment later, carrying a large, fluffy white towel. He approached her slowly, and Charlotte noticed the way his eyes seemed to be fixed very determinedly on her face, as if he was actively avoiding looking anywhere else. "Here." He held out the towel, but when Charlotte reached for it, their fingers brushed, sending an electric shock up her arm. Alexander jerked his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Thank you," Charlotte murmured, wrapping the towel around her shoulders. The soft terry cloth was warm and smelled faintly of expensive fabric softener and Alexander's cologne. "The bathroom is down the hall, second door on the right," Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. "There's a hairdryer in the cabinet under the sink. Take your time." But Charlotte made no move toward the bathroom. Instead, she took a small step closer to him, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "You know, I was just thinking," she said conversationally. "It's funny how often I seem to end up needing your help lately." Alexander's dark eyes narrowed slightly. "Is it?" Charlotte adjusted the towel, letting it slip just enough to reveal the delicate line of her collarbone. "First the coffee emergency, then the internet crisis, now this. You must think I'm incredibly accident-prone, or incredibly calculating." The accusation hung in the air between them, but Charlotte didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she smiled, a slow, mischievous curve of her lips that made Alexander's expression grow even more guarded. "Would that bother you?" she asked softly. "If I was being calculating?" Alexander was quiet for so long that Charlotte began to wonder if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and carefully measured. "What are you doing, Charlotte? I have no idea what you mean. Don't play games with me." Alexander took a step closer, close enough that Charlotte had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "You're a smart girl. Smart enough to check the weather forecast before leaving home without an umbrella. Smart enough to know that walking 20 blocks in a downpour would leave you looking exactly like this." His gaze dropped briefly to where the towel had slipped, revealing the wet fabric of her blouse underneath, before snapping back to her face. "Maybe I just wanted to see you," Charlotte said honestly, abandoning all pretense. The confession hung between them, brave and vulnerable and slightly breathless. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they were filled with something that looked almost like pain. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "you need to stop." "Stop what?" "This. Whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at the space between them, at her in her wet clothes, and his obvious struggle to maintain his composure. "You're playing with something you don't understand." "I understand more than you think I do." Charlotte let the towel slip a little more, revealing the graceful line of her neck and the hollow of her throat. "I understand that you watch me when you think I'm not looking. I understand that you held onto my hand a little too long when you gave me the towel just now, and I understand that right now you're trying very hard not to look at me the way you want to." Alexander's jaw clenched. "You're David's little sister. I'm 19 years old. You're 13 years younger than me. So, Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, clearly frustrated. "So you should be dating college boys your own age, not running around trying to seduce men who are old enough to know better." The word seduce sent a thrill through Charlotte that she tried hard to hide. "Is that what I'm doing? Seducing you?" "Aren't you?" Charlotte considered this seriously for a moment. "I suppose I am." she admitted. Is it working? The question seemed to break something in Alexander's carefully maintained control. In 2 quick strides, he closed the distance between them, backing her against the marble wall with his hands braced on either side of her head. You want to know if it's working? His voice was rough, dangerous. You want to know what you're doing to me, Charlotte? Charlotte's breath caught. This close, she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. Yes, she whispered. Alexander leaned closer, so close that his breath whispered across her ear when he spoke. You're driving me absolutely insane, he admitted in a low growl. Every time you show up at my door with some ridiculous excuse, every time you look at me with those eyes, every time you smile like you know exactly what you're doing to me, it takes everything I have not to— He cut himself off abruptly, pushing away from the wall and putting several feet of space between them. Not to what? Charlotte asked breathlessly. Alexander's eyes were wild, conflicted. Not to forget that you're supposed to be off limits. Who says I'm off limits? Your brother, for one. Common sense, for another. Alexander's voice was strained. You're too young, too innocent, too— I'm not that innocent, Charlotte interrupted, her cheeks flushing pink. The admission seemed to hit Alexander like a physical blow. He stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Go dry off, Charlotte, he said finally, his voice hoarse. Before I do something we'll both regret. But Charlotte didn't move. Instead, she let the towel drop completely, revealing her soaked blouse and the clear outline of her bra underneath. Alexander's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet penthouse. What if I wouldn't regret it? She asked softly. For a moment, Charlotte thought he might actually give in. His dark eyes blazed with something that made her stomach flip, and she saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. But then his phone buzzed loudly from the kitchen counter, breaking the spell. Alexander glanced at the screen, and his expression immediately shuttered. It's David, he said tersely. He's calling from Tokyo. The mention of her brother was like a bucket of cold water. Charlotte quickly retrieved the towel, wrapping it tightly around herself as Alexander answered the call. Hey David, how's the merger going? Alexander's voice was carefully normal, but Charlotte noticed the way he avoided looking at her as he spoke. She couldn't hear David's response, but she could hear the warmth and familiarity in her brother's distant voice as Alexander moved toward the kitchen for privacy. The sound was a sharp reminder of exactly how complicated this situation had become. When Alexander returned 10 minutes later, his expression was carefully neutral once again. David sends his love, he said formally. He wanted to make sure you're settling in okay at Columbia. That's nice, Charlotte said quietly, suddenly feeling very young and very foolish, standing there in her wet clothes and borrowed towel. The guest bathroom is down the hall, Alexander said, his tone professionally polite. Please, take all the time you need to get dried off. This time, Charlotte didn't argue. She made her way to the bathroom on unsteady legs, closing the door behind her and leaning against it heavily. In the mirror, she looked exactly like what she was, a 19-year-old girl playing a dangerous game with a man who was clearly fighting his own demons about the situation. But she'd seen the look in Alexander's eyes before David's call interrupted them. She'd felt the tension crackling between them, had heard the rough want in his voice when he admitted she was driving him insane. Whatever was happening between them, it was far from over. Charlotte had been planning her next strategic visit to Alexander's penthouse when the universe decided to intervene with what felt like the worst flu of her life. It started with a scratchy throat during her morning economics seminar and progressed rapidly to full-body aches, chills, and a fever that left her feeling like she'd been hit by a truck. By Thursday evening, she was curled up on her couch in pajama pants and an oversized Columbia sweatshirt, surrounded by used tissues and empty tea mugs, when the doorbell rang. Charlotte groaned, pulling a pillow over her head. She'd been ignoring calls from her study group all day, and the last thing she wanted was a well-meaning classmate checking on her. The knocking persisted, followed by a familiar, deep voice calling her name. Charlotte? Are you in there? Alexander. Charlotte sat up so quickly that the room spun around her. What was he doing here? She glanced at her reflection in the dark television screen and winced. Her hair was a tangled mess, her nose was red from constant tissue use, and she was pretty sure she looked like death warmed over. Charlotte, I'm coming in, Alexander announced, and she heard the distinctive sound of a key in the lock. Of course he has a spare key to her apartment, she thought dimly. David probably gave it to him for emergencies. The door opened and Alexander stepped inside, looking perfectly put together in a charcoal wool coat and dark jeans. His expression shifted from mild concern to alarm the moment he saw her. "Jesus," he breathed, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. "You look terrible." "Gee, thanks," Charlotte croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly what every girl wants to hear." Alexander's mouth quirked into a brief smile despite his obvious concern. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, and Charlotte closed her eyes at the blissfully cool touch. "You're burning up," he said, his voice tight with worry. "When's the last time you took your temperature?" "Don't have a thermometer," Charlotte admitted. "But I feel awful, so I'm pretty sure I'm dying." "You're not dying, you dramatic brat," Alexander said, but his tone was gentle. "Though you're definitely running a high fever. Have you eaten anything today?" Charlotte tried to remember. "Some crackers this morning, maybe?" Alexander's expression darkened. "Charlotte, that's not enough. You need fluids, medication, and actual food. When's the last time you took anything for the fever?" "I don't have any medicine," she admitted reluctantly. "I kept meaning to go to the pharmacy, but I felt too awful to leave the apartment." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying her flushed face and glassy eyes. Then, without warning, he scooped her up from the couch, one arm under her knees and the other supporting her back. "What are you doing?" Charlotte squeaked, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck. "Taking you upstairs where I can take proper care of you," Alexander said matter-of-factly, carrying her toward the door. "Your apartment doesn't have the supplies you need and you're in no condition to be left alone." "Alexander, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm, brooking no argument. "David would kill me if I let his little sister waste away from neglect while he was out of the country." Charlotte wanted to argue that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself, but the truth was, she felt so awful that the idea of letting someone else handle things was incredibly appealing. And if that someone happened to be Alexander. The elevator ride to the penthouse passed in a blur. Charlotte found herself pressed against Alexander's chest, breathing in his familiar cologne and trying not to think about how good it felt to be held by him, even under these circumstances. Alexander carried her directly to the master bedroom, his bedroom, and set her gently on the massive king-size bed. Charlotte had fantasized about being in Alexander's bedroom more times than she cared to admit, but never under circumstances quite like these. "Stay put," Alexander instructed, pulling the plush comforter up to her chin. "I'm going to get you some medicine and something to eat." Charlotte was too exhausted to do anything but nod. She sank back against the soft pillows, marveling at how the expensive bedding seemed to envelop her like a cloud. The room smelled like Alexander, masculine and sophisticated and somehow comforting. Alexander returned 20 minutes later with a breakfast tray loaded with supplies, a digital thermometer, fever reducer, throat lozenges, a steaming bowl of soup that smelled like heaven, and a large glass of orange juice. 102.4, he announced after taking her temperature. "High, but not dangerous. Here, take these." He handed her 2 white pills and the orange juice, watching carefully to make sure she swallowed them both. Then he settled himself on the edge of the bed with the soup bowl. "I'm not hungry," Charlotte protested weakly. "You need to eat something," Alexander said firmly. "Just a few spoonfuls, please." The please did her in. Charlotte allowed him to feed her small sips of the soup, which was absolutely delicious, and definitely not from a can. It was clearly homemade, rich with vegetables and tender pieces of chicken. "Did you make this?" she asked between spoonfuls. Alexander looked almost embarrassed. "I may have called my housekeeper for the recipe. She talked me through it over the phone." The idea of Alexander Blackwood, powerful businessman and confirmed bachelor, calling his housekeeper to learn how to make chicken soup for her was so sweetly unexpected that Charlotte felt her eyes well up with tears. "Hey," Alexander said softly, noticing her expression. "What's wrong? Are you feeling worse?" "No," Charlotte whispered, a tear escaping down her cheek. No one's ever taken care of me like this before." Alexander's expression grew tender. He set the soup bowl aside and reached out to brush the tear away with his thumb. "Your parents never took care of you when you were sick?" Charlotte gave a bitter laugh. My parents were always too busy with their social calendar to deal with sick children. They'd send the nanny with medicine and instructions to stay in my room until I was better. Alexander's jaw tightened. That's not how it should be. David used to sneak me ice cream and comic books, Charlotte continued, her voice growing drowsy as the medication began to take effect. He was the only one who ever really worried about me. He still worries about you, Alexander said quietly. He calls me at least twice a week asking if I've seen you, if you seem to be eating enough, if you look stressed about school. Charlotte smiled sleepily. He's a good brother. Yes, he is. Alexander adjusted the comforter around her, which is why he'd probably murder me if he knew I was sitting on his little sister's sickbed, thinking about how beautiful you look even with a fever. The admission was so quiet that Charlotte almost missed it. Her eyes flew open, meeting Alexander's dark gaze. You think I'm beautiful, she whispered. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. You're going to be the death of me, Charlotte Hayes, he said softly. Even sick as a dog, you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs, despite her fever-induced exhaustion. Alexander, shh. He pressed a gentle finger to her lips. You're sick and probably delirious from the fever. Go to sleep. Will you stay? The question slipped out before Charlotte could stop it, but she found she didn't want to take it back. Please? I don't want to be alone. Alexander hesitated for so long that Charlotte thought he might refuse. Then he nodded slowly. I'll stay until the fever breaks, he promised. But I'm sleeping in the chair, not in the bed with you. Charlotte wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling her under. She felt Alexander's cool hand smooth her hair back from her forehead, heard him murmur something that sounded like, "Sweet dreams, beautiful girl," and then consciousness faded completely. When she woke hours later, her fever had broken, and she was drenched in sweat but feeling significantly more human. Pale morning light was filtering through the bedroom windows, and Alexander was slumped in the leather armchair beside the bed, still fully dressed, but clearly having dozed off while keeping watch over her. Charlotte studied his sleeping face in the soft light. The hard lines of his usual expression were relaxed, making him look younger, less intimidating. His dark hair was mussed from running his hands through it, and there was a day's worth of stubble on his jaw. He'd stayed. All night he'd stayed and watched over her, making sure she was okay. As if sensing her gaze, Alexander's eyes opened slowly. When he saw her watching him, he sat up quickly, immediately alert. "How are you feeling?" he asked, reaching over to press his hand to her forehead. "The fever's broken. That's good." "Much better," Charlotte said honestly. "Thanks to you." Alexander stood and stretched, wincing slightly. "Sleeping in chairs isn't as easy as it used to be," he muttered. "You could have slept in the bed," Charlotte pointed out. "It's your bed, after all." Alexander's eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them. "No," he said quietly. "I couldn't have." The implication hung in the air, that sharing a bed with her, even innocently, would have been too much temptation for his already strained self-control. "Alexander," Charlotte began, but he was already moving toward the door. "I'll make you some breakfast," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Something light. Toast and tea, maybe." "Alexander, wait." Charlotte struggled to sit up, the comforter falling away from her overheated body. "Last night you said—" "I said a lot of things last night," Alexander interrupted, his voice carefully neutral. "You were sick and vulnerable, and I was worried. People say things they don't mean when emotions are running high." Charlotte stared at him, hurt blooming in her chest. "So you didn't mean it? When you said I was beautiful?" Alexander closed his eyes briefly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. When he opened them again, his expression was pained. "It doesn't matter what I meant, Charlotte. It doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," Charlotte whispered. But Alexander was already gone, leaving her alone in his bedroom with the lingering scent of his cologne and the memory of his hands tenderly caring for her through the long night. Outside the bedroom windows, New York was waking up to another day. But inside the penthouse, Charlotte felt like something fundamental had shifted between her and Alexander, something that neither of them would be able to ignore much longer, no matter how hard he tried. The changed password should have been Charlotte's first clue that something was different. 3 days after her fever broke and she'd returned to her own apartment, she'd shown up at Alexander's penthouse, with her usual morning excuse, this time claiming she needed to borrow vanilla extract for a baking project, only to find that her spare key no longer worked. Standing in the marble hallway outside his door, Charlotte stared at the key in her palm as if it had personally betrayed her. Alexander had changed the locks, or at least he'd changed the access code for the electronic system. Either way, the message was crystal clear. Her easy access to his private space had been revoked. The realization stung more than it should have. She knocked on the door instead, adopting her most innocent expression when Alexander answered. He was dressed for work in an impeccably tailored navy suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression carefully neutral. But Charlotte noticed the way his eyes immediately scanned her from head to toe, as if checking to make sure she was fully recovered from her illness. "Good morning," she said brightly, holding up the spare key. "I think there might be something wrong with your lock system. My key isn't working." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's because I changed the access codes yesterday." "Oh," Charlotte blinked, as if this possibility hadn't occurred to her. "Was there a security issue?" "You could say that." Alexander's dark eyes met hers steadily. "I decided it was time to limit access to my private residence to people who actually need it for legitimate emergencies." The pointed comment hung between them, and Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. He was calling her out, politely but unmistakably, on her pattern of manufactured crises. "I see," she said quietly. "Well, I actually did need to borrow some vanilla extract. I'm making cookies for my study group and I ran out." Alexander studied her face for a long moment, and Charlotte held her breath, wondering if he'd refuse her this small request. Finally, he stepped aside to let her enter. "5 minutes," he said as she passed him. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes." The penthouse felt different somehow, less welcoming, more formal. Or maybe that was just Alexander's demeanor, which had returned to the politely distant tone he'd used when she first moved into the building. Gone was the gentle man who'd fed her soup and watched over her while she was sick. In his place stood the composed businessman who tolerated his best friend's little sister out of obligation. Charlotte found the vanilla extract in his immaculate kitchen and turned to find Alexander watching her from the doorway, checking his expensive watch with barely concealed impatience. "Here," she said, holding up the small bottle. "I'll bring this back tomorrow." "Keep it," Alexander said curtly. "I rarely bake." "Okay." Charlotte fidgeted with the bottle, suddenly desperate to break through the wall of professional politeness he'd erected between them. "Alexander, about the other night when I was sick." "You were delirious with fever," Alexander cut her off smoothly. "People say and hear things differently when they're not well. I wouldn't read too much into it." The dismissal was gentle, but final, and Charlotte felt something crack inside her chest. He was taking it back, all of it. The tender care, the sweet confessions, the moment of vulnerability when he'd admitted she was beautiful. He was packaging it all up as fever-induced nonsense and filing it away where it couldn't complicate their lives. "Right," she said softly. "Of course, fever makes people imagine things." Something flickered in Alexander's expression. Regret, perhaps, or pain. But it was gone too quickly for Charlotte to be sure. "I should go," she said, clutching the vanilla extract like a lifeline. "Thanks for this." "Charlotte." Alexander's voice stopped her at the elevator. She turned hopefully, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Maybe it would be best if you knocked before coming up from now on. Give me a chance to make sure it's a convenient time." The formal request felt like a door slamming shut. Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "Of course, I'm sorry for all the intrusions." As the elevator doors closed between them, Charlotte caught a glimpse of Alexander still standing in his doorway, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and something that looked suspiciously like longing in his dark eyes. But by the time she reached her own apartment, Charlotte had convinced herself she'd imagined it. The pattern continued for the next week. Charlotte knocked politely before visiting, kept her excuses legitimate and her stays brief. Alexander was unfailingly courteous but distant, treating her with the same polite attention he might show any acquaintance. The easy familiarity they'd been building was gone, replaced by careful formality that made Charlotte's chest ache. It was during one of these stilted interactions, Charlotte had needed to borrow a phone charger after hers mysteriously broke, that David called from Tokyo. Charlotte was perched on the edge of Alexander's leather couch, trying to make small talk while her phone charged, when Alexander's cell rang. The name on the screen made both of them freeze. "It's David," Alexander said unnecessarily, glancing at Charlotte with something that might have been panic in his eyes. "Answer it," Charlotte said quietly. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Not really. As Alexander answered the call and moved toward the kitchen for privacy, Charlotte couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation. "She's doing well in school. Yes, I've seen her a few times. Just brief encounters in the building. Of course I'd tell you if there were any problems." Each careful half-truth felt like a small betrayal. Not that Alexander was lying exactly. He was being technically accurate while omitting the emotional complexity of their recent interactions. But the clinical way he discussed her with David, as if she were merely a responsibility to be monitored, rather than a person he'd held while she was sick, stung more than Charlotte expected. When Alexander returned from the kitchen 15 minutes later, his expression was even more guarded than usual. "David sends his love," he said formally. "He's pleased to hear you're settling in well at Columbia." "That's nice," Charlotte replied, unplugging her phone. "Well, I should go. Thanks for the charger." She was almost to the elevator when Alexander's voice stopped her. "Charlotte, wait." She turned, hope fluttering stupidly in her chest, but Alexander's expression was serious rather than warm. "David mentioned something during our call," he said carefully. "He's concerned that you might... That is, he's worried you might develop inappropriate feelings for someone older and more experienced. Someone who might take advantage of your youth and inexperience." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. "He said that? He's protective of you," Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "And he's right to be concerned. You're 19, Charlotte. You should be dating boys your own age, having age-appropriate relationships, not..." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. "Not what?" Charlotte asked quietly. "Not developing feelings for you?" Alexander's jaw clenched. "David is my best friend. He trusts me to look out for you, not to complicate your life with situations you're not ready to handle. What if I think I am ready? You're not." Alexander's voice was firm, but Charlotte caught the slight tremor in it. "You're smart and beautiful, and you have your whole life ahead of you. You don't need some jaded older man screwing that up for you. Is that what you think you'd be doing?" Charlotte stepped closer, studying his face intently. "Screwing up my life?" Alexander looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I think you deserve better than whatever this is." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Charlotte felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his rejection hurt. "You're probably right," she said with forced lightness. "I should focus on school anyway. Too much drama isn't good for my GPA." She turned toward the elevator again, but Alexander's next words stopped her cold. "Charlotte." His voice was rough, pained. "It's not that I don't..." He stopped himself, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "It's not that simple." Charlotte turned back to face him, her heart hammering. "Then explain it to me." "I can't." Alexander's dark eyes were tortured. "I promised David I'd look out for you, not feel things I have no right to feel." The admission hung between them, electric and dangerous. Charlotte took a step toward him, then another, until she was close enough to see the gold flecks in his eyes. "What kind of things?" she whispered. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his control visibly fraying. Then he seemed to remember himself, stepping back abruptly. "It doesn't matter," he said firmly. "What matters is that you're David's little sister, and I'm going to respect that. Even if it kills me." The confession was raw, honest, and more painful than any gentle rejection could have been. Charlotte felt her heart break and soar simultaneously. He did care about her, but he was choosing duty over desire, loyalty over love. "Alexander." "Go home, Charlotte," he said quietly. "Please. Before I do something we'll both regret." This time, Charlotte didn't argue. She walked to the elevator on unsteady legs, acutely aware that Alexander was watching her every step. When the doors closed and she was finally alone, she allowed the tears to fall. Alexander Blackwood was in love with her, or at least he was fighting very hard not to be. But he was also determined to do the honorable thing, even if it destroyed them both in the process. Charlotte wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. She'd spent weeks playing games, manufacturing excuses to see him, testing the boundaries of his control. But this wasn't a game anymore. This was real and messy, and more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Charlotte stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of the Columbia Library, applying a final coat of lip gloss with hands that trembled slightly from nerves rather than excitement. Her plan was either brilliant or completely insane. She hadn't decided which yet. But after a week of Alexander's painful politeness and careful distance, she was desperate enough to try anything. Even if that anything involved using poor, unsuspecting Jake Morrison as an unwitting accomplice in her scheme to make Alexander Blackwood jealous. Jake was perfect for her purposes. Tall, sandy-haired, with the kind of easy smile that made him popular with professors and classmates alike. He was also completely harmless. A sweet, earnest pre-law student who'd been trying to ask Charlotte out for weeks. When she'd finally said yes to coffee that afternoon, his face had lit up like Christmas morning. Charlotte felt a pang of guilt about her ulterior motives, but she pushed it aside. Jake would have a nice time, she'd make sure of that. And if Alexander happened to see them together, well, that would just be a happy coincidence. She checked her appearance one more time, smoothing down the soft pink sweater that clung to her curves in all the right places. Her honey blonde hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and she'd chosen jeans that Jake had definitely noticed when she walked into the coffee shop an hour earlier. Ready for phase 2, she murmured to her reflection, then pulled out her phone to execute the most crucial part of her plan. She posed with Jake outside the library, his arm around her waist as they both smiled at the camera. Then another shot of them sharing a piece of chocolate cake at the coffee shop, their heads bent close together as if sharing secrets. Finally, a selfie of just herself, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright, with the caption, "Perfect afternoon with the sweetest guy. Sometimes the best surprises come when you're not looking for them." She posted all 3 photos to her Instagram story, making sure they were visible to all her followers, including, she knew from previous stalking sessions, one Alexander Blackwood. "Everything okay?" Jake asked when she returned to their table, slipping her phone back into her purse with studied casualness. "Perfect," Charlotte said, giving him her brightest smile. "Sorry about that. Just sharing what a great time I'm having." Jake's grin widened. "I'm having a great time too. I was actually wondering, there's this party tomorrow night at my fraternity house. It's supposed to be pretty fun. Would you maybe want to go with me?" Charlotte hesitated. She genuinely liked Jake. He was funny and kind and exactly the type of uncomplicated guy she should probably be dating. But her heart belonged to someone else, someone who was currently doing his best to pretend she didn't exist. "I'd love to," she heard herself say, because what else could she do? And maybe it would be good for her to spend time with someone who actually wanted to be seen with her in public. They spent another hour talking about classes and professors, sharing stories about their respective hometowns, laughing at Jake's surprisingly good impressions of various faculty members. By the time they parted ways outside the library, Charlotte almost managed to forget that this had started as a scheme to manipulate another man's emotions. 2 hours later, Charlotte was curled up on her couch with a textbook and a cup of tea when someone pounded on her door with enough force to rattle the hinges. She nearly spilled her drink, her heart jumping into her throat at the aggressive sound. "Charlotte!" Alexander's voice boomed through the thin walls. "Open this door right now." Charlotte set down her tea with shaking hands and hurried to the door, peering through the peephole. Alexander stood in the hallway, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his expression thunderous. His expensive suit jacket was gone, his tie loosened, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, as if he'd been tugging at it in frustration. She'd never seen him look so completely undone. Charlotte opened the door slowly, trying to project an air of innocent confusion, even as her pulse hammered with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Alexander, what's wrong? You look—" "Cut the act, Charlotte." Alexander stepped into her apartment without being invited, crowding her personal space in a way that made her acutely aware of how much larger and stronger he was. "We both know exactly what's wrong. I really don't—" "This." Alexander held up his phone where Charlotte's Instagram story was displayed in all its romantic glory. The photo of her and Jake sharing cake was enlarged on the screen, and Charlotte could see the fury in Alexander's dark eyes as he stared at it. "Who is he?" Charlotte lifted her chin defiantly, even as her heart raced. His name is Jake. He's in my constitutional law class. Your boyfriend? The word came out like Alexander was spitting something distasteful. I don't see how that's any of your business, Charlotte replied with a coolness she didn't feel. You made it very clear last week that my personal life isn't your concern. Alexander's jaw clenched so hard that Charlotte could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Did he touch you? The question was asked in a voice so low and dangerous that Charlotte felt a shiver run down her spine. But she'd come this far, she might as well see it through. We held hands, she said with deliberate casualness. He had his arm around me. Normal dating behavior for people our age. Alexander made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a curse. Charlotte. And we kissed, she added, the lie slipping out before she could stop herself. Jake's a really good kisser, actually. Very thorough. The effect of her words on Alexander was immediate and devastating. His face went pale, then flushed with rage, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, Charlotte actually worried he might punch a hole in her wall. You kissed him, Alexander repeated, his voice deadly quiet. Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She'd never seen Alexander lose control like this, had never seen him look so close to violence. It should have been frightening, but instead it was thrilling in a way that made her feel slightly dizzy. Where? Alexander demanded. Where what? Where did he kiss you? Alexander's eyes blazed with something primal and possessive. Your mouth, your neck? Did he put his hands on you? Charlotte's breath caught. The raw jealousy in Alexander's voice was everything she'd hoped for and more. I don't think that's appropriate for us to discuss. Fuck appropriate. Alexander closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, backing her against the closed door with his hands braced on either side of her head. Did he touch you? Charlotte stared up at him, mesmerized by the fury and want warring in his expression. This was not the controlled businessman she'd been dealing with for the past week. This was something much more primal, much more dangerous. Why do you care? She whispered. You know why I care. Alexander's voice was rough, broken. You know exactly why this is killing me. Tell me anyway. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because you're mine, he admitted with tortured honesty. Because every time I see you, every time you smile, every time you laugh at some silly joke, I fall a little deeper in love with you. And the thought of some boy putting his hands on you, kissing you, touching what belongs to me. He cut himself off abruptly, as if realizing what he'd just confessed. I belong to you, Charlotte asked breathlessly. Alexander closed his eyes tightly, leaning his forehead against the door above her head. You shouldn't. Christ, Charlotte, you should run as far away from me as you can get. What if I don't want to run? You should want to. Alexander's voice was muffled against the door. I'm 13 years older than you. I'm your brother's best friend. I'm supposed to be protecting you, not falling in love with you. The confession hung between them, raw and honest and completely devastating. Charlotte reached up with trembling hands to cup Alexander's face, forcing him to meet her eyes. I lied, she whispered. Alexander's brows drew together in confusion. What? About Jake. We didn't kiss. We barely held hands. Charlotte watched as relief and understanding dawned in Alexander's expression. I was trying to make you jealous. You little... Alexander's eyes narrowed, but there was as much admiration as exasperation in his voice. You manipulative, scheming, beautiful little brat. Did it work? Charlotte asked with a tremulous smile. Instead of answering, Alexander cupped her face in his large hands and crushed his mouth to hers. The kiss was everything Charlotte had imagined and more, desperate, hungry, full of months of suppressed longing and frustrated desire. Alexander kissed her like a man drowning, like she was air and he'd been holding his breath for years. His hands tangled in her hair, holding her exactly where he wanted her as his mouth moved against hers with barely leashed passion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. This is insane, he murmured. Your brother is going to kill me. David doesn't have to know, Charlotte whispered, her lips still tingling from his kiss. Not yet. Not until we figure out what this is. I know what this is, Alexander said quietly, his dark eyes intense as they searched her face. The question is whether you're brave enough to handle it. Charlotte rose up on her tiptoes and kissed him again, softer this time but no less meaningful. "Try me," she whispered against his lips. Alexander's answering smile was both tender and predatory, and Charlotte felt her world tilt on its axis. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next, they were in it together. The first week of their secret relationship felt like living in a beautiful, terrifying dream. Charlotte would catch herself smiling at random moments during lectures, remembering the way Alexander had kissed her goodnight at her door the evening before, or how he'd texted her sweet good-morning messages that made her heart flutter like a teenager's, which she supposed she technically still was. Their first official date had been a carefully orchestrated affair. Alexander had picked her up 3 blocks from her building, driving her to a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, where no one from their usual Manhattan circles would think to look for them. He'd been nervous, actually nervous, fidgeting with his wine glass and stumbling slightly over words in a way that was so unlike his usual commanding presence that Charlotte had found it utterly endearing. "I haven't done this in a while," he'd admitted over dessert, his dark eyes vulnerable in the candlelight. "Dated someone?" Charlotte had asked, twirling tiramisu on her fork. "Dated someone who matters," Alexander had corrected quietly, and Charlotte's heart had performed a complete somersault in her chest. Now, a week later, Charlotte was learning that Alexander Blackwood in love was a revelation. Gone was the distant, controlled businessman she'd been trying to crack for months. In his place was a man who texted her photos of sunrises from his morning runs with captions like, "Thought of you when I saw this," and who had somehow memorized her class schedule so he could time his coffee breaks to accidentally run into her on campus. He was also, Charlotte discovered with delighted surprise, incredibly protective in ways that were both sweet and slightly possessive. "I don't like him," Alexander announced on Thursday evening as they walked through Central Park, his arm wrapped securely around Charlotte's waist. "You don't even know him," Charlotte laughed, referring to her study partner Marcus, who had committed the apparent crime of offering to help her with her statistics homework. "He's just being friendly." "He's being friendly because he wants to get into your pants," Alexander said bluntly, then immediately looked mortified. "Sorry, that was crude." "It was also probably accurate," Charlotte admitted with a grin. "Marcus has been trying to ask me out since September, but I'm taken, remember?" Alexander's expression softened immediately. He stopped walking and turned to face her, cupping her face gently in his hands. "Are you?" he asked quietly. "Taken, I mean." "Completely," Charlotte whispered, rising up on her tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Hopelessly. Probably permanently, if I'm being honest." Alexander's answering smile could have powered half of Manhattan. "Good," he murmured against her lips, "because I'm not letting you go. Not now, not ever." The intensity of his declaration should have been overwhelming, but instead, Charlotte felt a warm sense of rightness settle in her chest. This was what she'd been waiting for without even knowing it. Not just Alexander's attention or his desire, but his complete and utter devotion. Their stolen moments together were precious and carefully guarded. Alexander would pick her up from late classes, driving her home through the city while they talked about everything and nothing. They shared quiet dinners in his penthouse, cooking together in his beautiful kitchen, while jazz played softly in the background. Charlotte learned that Alexander was surprisingly domestic when he wanted to be, that he made excellent pasta sauce from scratch, and that he had a habit of humming unconsciously when he was content. She also learned that he was an incredibly attentive lover, even within the boundaries they'd carefully established. "We need to take this slow," Alexander had said after their third date, when they'd nearly lost control of themselves on his couch. "You're 19, Charlotte. You deserve to be courted properly, not rushed into something physical because I can't control myself around you." Charlotte had been torn between appreciation for his consideration and frustration at his restraint, but she'd also recognized the wisdom in his words. What they had was too important to risk by moving too fast, too precious to cheapen with hasty decisions made in the heat of passion. That didn't stop Alexander from finding other ways to drive her absolutely crazy with want. He had a habit of placing his hand on the small of her back when he guided her through doorways, his fingers spanning her waist in a way that made her acutely aware of how easily he could lift her, hold her, possess her completely. When they watched movies together on his couch, he would play with her hair absent-mindedly, his fingers combing through the silky strands in a way that made Charlotte want to purr like a cat. And his kisses, God, his kisses were becoming an addiction. Alexander kissed her like he was memorizing the taste of her, like every moment their lips touched was precious and fleeting. He would frame her face with his hands, his thumbs stroking over her cheekbones as he explored her mouth, with a thoroughness that left her breathless and aching. "You're going to be the death of me," he'd murmured against her throat one evening, his lips trailing kisses along the column of her neck while she arched beneath him on his couch. "Do you know that? Every time you make that little sound, every time you look at me like you want me to devour you whole—" "Maybe I do," Charlotte had whispered back, and felt Alexander's sharp intake of breath against her skin. But always, always, he pulled back before things went too far. He would help her straighten her clothes, smooth her hair, drive her home with hands that shook slightly on the steering wheel. Charlotte could see the restraint it cost him, could feel the tension radiating from his body, and she loved him even more for his determination to do right by her. The hardest part was maintaining their secret around other people. Charlotte had to bite her tongue when her roommate made comments about how happy she seemed lately, had to resist the urge to defend Alexander when her friends made jokes about older men and their midlife crises. She wanted to shout from the rooftops that she was in love with the most wonderful man in the world, wanted to post couple photos on Instagram and hold his hand in public and introduce him to everyone as her boyfriend. Instead, she had to settle for stolen glances across crowded rooms and text messages that made her blush in the middle of lectures. The closest they came to discovery happened on a Friday afternoon when Charlotte was leaving Alexander's penthouse after a lunch date. They'd been saying goodbye at his door, a process that had devolved into increasingly heated kisses against the doorframe, when the elevator dinged behind them. Charlotte jumped away from Alexander like she'd been burned, both of them turning to see who had arrived on the private penthouse floor. But it was only Mrs. Chen, Alexander's elderly neighbor from the other penthouse unit, returning from what appeared to be a shopping trip. "Oh, hello, dear, Mrs." Chen called cheerfully, clearly recognizing Charlotte from her previous emergencies. "How nice to see you visiting Alexander. You make such a lovely couple." Charlotte felt her face flame red, but Alexander stepped smoothly into the breach. "Charlotte was just returning a book she borrowed," he said calmly, though Charlotte noticed the slight tension in his jaw. "For her international business class." "Of course, Mrs." Chen said with a knowing twinkle in her eyes that suggested she wasn't fooled for a second. "Well, you two have a lovely afternoon." As soon as Mrs. Chen disappeared into her own apartment, Charlotte sagged against the wall. "Oh, God," she groaned. "She totally knows." "Mrs. Chen is discreet," Alexander assured her, though he looked slightly pale himself. "She won't say anything." "This is crazy," Charlotte said, suddenly feeling the weight of their deception. "All this sneaking around, all these lies." Alexander's expression grew serious. He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Do you want to stop?" he asked quietly. "Because I'll understand if this is too complicated, too stressful. I never wanted to put you in a position where you had to lie to people you care about." Charlotte looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the genuine concern there, the willingness to sacrifice his own happiness if it meant making things easier for her. It was so typically Alexander. Noble, self-sacrificing, always putting her needs before his own. "No," she said firmly, squeezing his hands. "I don't want to stop. I want you, Alexander. All of you. The complications, the secrecy, the risk. It's all worth it if it means I get to be with you." Alexander's relief was palpable. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "I love you," he said simply, and Charlotte's heart stopped beating for a moment before resuming at double time. It was the first time he'd said the words out loud, and they hung in the air between them like a promise, a declaration, a vow. "I love you too," Charlotte whispered back, and watched Alexander's face transform with joy. They were in this together now, completely and utterly. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced, they would face them as a team. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As Alexander kissed her goodbye, properly this time, with no fear of discovery, Charlotte knew that there was no going back. She was his, and he was hers, and somehow they would find a way to make it work. They had to. 3 weeks into their secret relationship, Charlotte thought she had learned to read Alexander's moods with the precision of a meteorologist tracking storm patterns. She knew the subtle tightening around his eyes when work stressed him, the way his shoulders relaxed when she walked into a room, the particular smile he reserved just for her that made her feel like the most important person in his universe. But she had never seen him look the way he did when he answered his phone during their quiet Sunday morning breakfast and heard David's voice on the other end. "David?" Alexander's voice was carefully neutral, but Charlotte watched the color drain from his face as he listened to whatever her brother was saying. "You're coming back early? Today?" Charlotte nearly choked on her coffee. David wasn't supposed to return from Tokyo for another week. She watched Alexander's expression grow increasingly tense as the conversation continued. "No problems here," Alexander was saying, his eyes finding Charlotte's across the kitchen island. "Everything's been quiet. Yes, I've seen Charlotte a few times at building stuff, you know how it is." Each careful half-truth made Charlotte's stomach clench with guilt and anxiety. She could hear the warmth and trust in David's distant voice through the phone, could imagine him smiling as he talked to his best friend, completely unaware that said friend was currently having breakfast with his little sister while wearing nothing but pajama pants and a t-shirt. "Your flight lands at noon." Alexander glanced at the kitchen clock, which read 10:15. "I can pick you up. No? Okay, well, I'll see you soon then." Alexander ended the call and set his phone down very carefully, as if it might explode. "David's coming home," he said unnecessarily. "I heard." Charlotte's voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Did he say why he's back early?" The merger wrapped up ahead of schedule. Alexander ran both hands through his dark hair, leaving it adorably mussed. "Charlotte, we need to talk about what happens now." The seriousness in his tone made Charlotte's chest tighten with premature dread. "What do you mean?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his untouched breakfast. When he looked up, his expression was pained but resolute. "We have to tell him," he said quietly. "About us." "Today?" Charlotte's voice came out as a squeak. "It has to be today. David's not stupid, and we've been getting careless. Yesterday you left your textbook here. Your hair tie is on my bathroom counter. There's a photo of us on my refrigerator that you insisted I print out." Alexander's eyes were gentle but firm. "He's going to figure it out, Charlotte, and when he does, I'd rather it come from us than from his own investigation." Charlotte knew he was right, but the thought of facing her protective older brother with news that she was in love with his best friend made her feel nauseated. "He's going to be furious," she said quietly. "Probably." Alexander's honesty wasn't comforting, but Charlotte appreciated it. "He's going to feel like I betrayed his trust, and maybe I did. Maybe we both did. Do you regret it?" The question slipped out before Charlotte could stop herself. "What we have—" Alexander was around the kitchen island in 2 quick strides, pulling her into his arms before she could blink. "Never," he said fiercely, his hands framing her face. "I could never regret loving you, Charlotte. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. But that doesn't mean this isn't going to hurt people we care about." Charlotte leaned into his touch, trying to memorize the feeling of his hands on her face, the warmth in his dark eyes. "What if he tells you to choose between him and me? Then I choose you." Alexander's answer was immediate and unwavering. "Every time, without question, I choose you." The declaration should have made her feel better, but instead it just highlighted how much they both stood to lose. David wasn't just Alexander's best friend. He was Charlotte's only family, the person who had raised her, protected her, loved her unconditionally since their parents had proven incapable of the task. "I don't want you to have to choose," Charlotte whispered. "And I don't want to," Alexander admitted, "which is why we need to handle this carefully. Show David that this isn't some passing infatuation or quarter-life crisis. Show him that we're serious about each other, that we've thought this through." "Have we?" Charlotte asked, suddenly feeling very young and very scared. "Thought it through, I mean. We've been living in this perfect bubble for 3 weeks, but what happens when the real world intrudes? What happens when people find out about us, when they start talking, judging? What happens when you get tired of dating someone who still has to ask her RA for permission to stay out past midnight?" Alexander's expression softened. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "What happens," he said quietly, "is that we figure it out together, one day at a time, one challenge at a time, Because that's what people do when they love each other, Charlotte. They face the world as a team. Before Charlotte could respond, Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and his expression grew grim. "David's here," he announced. "He's coming up." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. "Here? Now? But you said his flight didn't land until—" He must have taken an earlier flight. Alexander was already moving, grabbing Charlotte's jacket and purse from the counter. "You need to go. Now." "Alexander, wait. Charlotte, please." Alexander's voice was urgent as he guided her toward the service elevator that led to the building's back exit. "I need to talk to David alone first. Prepare him. This isn't how I wanted to tell him, but if he sees you here like this—" He gestured vaguely at her casual appearance, her sleep-mussed hair, the obvious intimacy of their Sunday morning scene. "Okay," Charlotte said, though every instinct screamed at her to stay and fight. "But Alexander, whatever happens with David, it doesn't change how I feel about you. It doesn't change us." Alexander kissed her quickly, desperately, like a man saying goodbye before going to war. "I love you," he said against her lips. "Remember that no matter what happens in the next few hours." Charlotte was halfway down the service elevator when she heard the main elevator ding on the penthouse floor. Through the metal grating, she caught a glimpse of David stepping out, tall, dark-haired like Alexander, but with Charlotte's green eyes and their mother's stubborn chin. He looked tired from his long flight, but happy to be home. A duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a smile on his face that made Charlotte's heart clench with guilt. He was about to find out that his two favorite people in the world had been lying to him for weeks. As Charlotte made her escape through the building's service entrance, she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. The perfect bubble of their secret romance was about to burst, and she had no idea if what they had was strong enough to survive the fallout. But as she walked back to her own apartment, Alexander's promise echoing in her ears, Charlotte made a decision. Whatever happened with David, whatever consequences they faced, she wasn't giving up on Alexander Blackwood without a fight. Some things were worth fighting for, some people were worth the risk. And Alexander, brilliant, protective, hopelessly devoted Alexander, was definitely worth everything she had to give. Charlotte paced her small apartment like a caged animal, checking her phone every 30 seconds for any word from Alexander. 3 hours had passed since she'd escaped through the service elevator, 3 hours of complete radio silence that was driving her slowly insane with worry. She had tried texting him twice, casual messages asking if everything was okay, but received no response. Either Alexander was deep in conversation with David, or her brother had confiscated his phone after beating him to death with a law book. Given David's protective streak, both scenarios seemed equally plausible. When her doorbell finally rang at 4 in the afternoon, Charlotte nearly sprinted to answer it, hoping desperately to see Alexander's face on the other side. Instead, she found herself staring at her brother, and David Hayes looked absolutely furious. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, pushing past her into the apartment. "Right now." Charlotte's heart sank to somewhere around her ankles. David's jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was barely controlling his temper, and there was a betrayed hurt in his green eyes that made Charlotte want to curl up and disappear. "David," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. 18 months, he said, his voice deadly quiet. 18 months I've been asking Alexander to keep an eye on you, to make sure you were safe, to look out for you like the little sister I couldn't be here to protect myself." Charlotte winced. When David got this angry, he tended to speak in short, clipped sentences that felt like verbal slaps. "And you know what he's been doing instead," David continued, beginning to pace her small living room like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "He's been seducing my 19-year-old sister, my baby sister, who I trusted him to protect." "It's not like that," Charlotte said quickly. "David, if you would just let me explain—" "Explain what?" David whirled to face her, his eyes flashing. "Explain how my best friend has been lying to my face for weeks. Explain how you've been sneaking around behind my back like a teenager with a forbidden crush." "I am a teenager," Charlotte shot back, her own temper finally flaring. "And this isn't some crush, David. I'm in love with him." The declaration hung in the air between them, and Charlotte watched her brother's face cycle through surprise, pain, and renewed anger. "You're 19, David said finally. Or you think you're in love with every guy who pays attention to you. That's not true, and you know it. Charlotte lifted her chin defiantly. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Alexander is 32 years old, David interrupted. He's a grown man with years of experience manipulating business deals and people. You're a college sophomore who still calls me when you can't figure out how to work the washing machine in your building. Each word stung, but Charlotte forced herself to stand straighter. Just because I'm younger doesn't mean my feelings aren't real. Your feelings? David laughed bitterly. Charlotte, do you have any idea what people are going to say when they find out? Do you understand how this looks? My successful older friend dating my barely legal sister. I don't care what people say. Well, I do. David's voice rose slightly. I care about your reputation, your future, your safety. And I care about the fact that my best friend looked me in the eye 2 hours ago and told me he's been falling in love with you for months. Like that's supposed to make this better somehow. Charlotte's heart stuttered. He said he was falling in love with me? Don't. David's voice was sharp. Don't get that dreamy look in your eyes. This isn't some romantic fairy tale, Charlotte. This is real life, with real consequences. What did you say to him? Charlotte demanded, suddenly terrified. David, what did you do? I told him the truth. David's expression was stone cold. That he's crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. That our friendship is over. And that if he comes near you again, I'll destroy him professionally and personally. Charlotte felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You didn't. I did. David's voice was final, unyielding. And I meant every word. David, you can't. Charlotte's voice broke. He's your best friend. He's been your friend for 10 years. And in 10 seconds he threw all of that away the moment he decided to pursue my little sister. David's anger was giving way to something that looked almost like grief. Do you understand what this means, Charlotte? I can't trust him anymore. How am I supposed to look at my best friend and not see the man who's been lying to me about touching my baby sister? He didn't lie about touching me, Charlotte said quietly, then immediately regretted the words when David's face went white. Jesus Christ, Charlotte. David sank down onto a couch, suddenly looking exhausted. Please tell me that you two haven't. We haven't, Charlotte said quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. We've been taking things slow. Alexander insisted on it. He said I deserved to be courted properly, not rushed into anything physical. David was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less pained. That's something, I suppose. He looked up at her with tired eyes. Charlotte, I need you to understand something. This isn't about me trying to control your life or treat you like a child. This is about me trying to protect you from a situation that could seriously hurt you. Charlotte sat down beside him on the couch, suddenly feeling drained from their argument. How could loving Alexander hurt me? Because you're 19 and he's 32, David said patiently. Because you're at completely different stages of your lives. Because when you're 25 and ready to start thinking about marriage and children, he'll be 38 and probably already settled in his ways. Because the power imbalance between you is staggering. He could support you financially without blinking, which means you'd always be dependent on him. Because you think I'm too young and stupid to make my own decisions, Charlotte finished bitterly. David sighed. I think you're young and inexperienced and in love for the first time, which makes it hard to see potential problems clearly. And what if you're wrong? Charlotte turned to face him fully. What if Alexander and I really are meant to be together? What if this is real, David? What if we could have had something beautiful and you've destroyed it because you can't accept that I'm not your little sister anymore? David was quiet for so long that Charlotte began to hope she'd gotten through to him, but when he finally spoke, his voice was resolute. Then I guess we'll never know, he said quietly. Because I meant what I said to Alexander. This ends here, Charlotte. Today. And if I refuse? Charlotte's voice was barely above a whisper. What if I choose him over you? David's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment he looked less like her angry older brother and more like the scared 22-year-old who had fought for custody of her when their parents died. Then I guess I lose my little sister too, he said quietly. But I'd rather lose you to stubbornness than watch you get hurt by a situation you're not equipped to handle. Charlotte stared at her brother. This man who had sacrificed so much for her, who had given up his own youth to raise her, who loved her enough to risk her hatred in order to protect her. And for the first time since this whole mess began, she saw the situation from his perspective. To David, Alexander wasn't the man she was falling in love with. He was a predatory older man taking advantage of his innocent younger sister. He was a trusted friend who had betrayed that trust in the most personal way possible. "I love you, David," Charlotte said quietly, "more than almost anyone in the world. But I love him too." David nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "I know you do, sweetheart, and that's what makes this so hard." They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in thought. Finally, David stood. "I'm flying back to Tokyo tomorrow morning," he said. "The merger isn't quite finished, and frankly, I need some distance from this situation. While I'm gone, I want you to really think about what I've said, about what you want your life to look like in 5 years, 10 years. "And Alexander?" Charlotte asked quietly. "Alexander knows where I stand." David's voice was final. "If he's the man I thought he was, he'll respect my wishes and leave you alone." After David left, Charlotte sat alone in her apartment as darkness fell outside her windows. Her phone remained stubbornly silent. No calls, no texts, no word from Alexander about how the confrontation had gone or what he was thinking. As the hours ticked by, a terrible understanding began to settle in Charlotte's chest. Alexander wasn't calling because he wasn't going to call. David had asked him to choose between their friendship and their relationship, and Alexander, noble, self-sacrificing Alexander, had chosen duty over desire. He was going to let her go without a fight, because that's what David wanted, because that's what he thought was best for her. Charlotte stared at her phone, willing it to ring, willing Alexander to prove her wrong. But as midnight came and went with no word, she realized that their perfect love story was over before it had really begun. The thought should have devastated her. Instead, it made her furious. If Alexander Blackwood thought he could make decisions about her life without consulting her, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Charlotte had always been told she inherited her stubbornness from her father and her strategic mind from her mother. She'd never been particularly grateful for either trait until Tuesday morning, when she stood outside Alexander's office building at 7 a.m., armed with coffee and a determination that could have moved mountains. She'd spent all of Monday in a haze of hurt and anger, waiting for Alexander to call, to text, to give her some sign that he was fighting for them. When her phone had remained silent, she'd finally understood that he'd made his choice, and she'd made hers. If Alexander Blackwood thought he could protect her by pushing her away, he was about to discover exactly how wrong he was. Charlotte positioned herself strategically near the building's main entrance, knowing that Alexander arrived at work every morning at 7:15 sharp. She'd dressed carefully for this confrontation, a navy dress that hugged her curves without being inappropriate, heels that made her legs look miles long, and just enough makeup to highlight her best features. She wasn't playing fair, and she didn't care. Alexander appeared exactly on schedule, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal suit, despite the exhaustion evident in his dark eyes. Charlotte felt her resolve waver for just a moment. He looked like he'd slept about as well as she had, which was to say not at all, but she steeled herself and stepped into his path. "Good morning, Alexander." He stopped so abruptly that the businessman behind him nearly collided with his back. For a moment, Alexander just stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, longing, and what looked suspiciously like panic. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be here." "Probably not," she agreed cheerfully, falling into step beside him as he reluctantly continued toward the building entrance. "But here I am anyway. Funny how that works." Alexander's jaw tightened. "We can't do this here. Not in public." "Then where can we do this?" Charlotte asked sweetly. "Your penthouse. Oh wait, you're not taking my calls. Your office? Oh wait, you've probably told your secretary to refuse me entry. So tell me, Alexander, where exactly am I supposed to have this conversation with my boyfriend?" "I'm not your boyfriend anymore." The words came out harsh, pained. "You know that." "Actually, I don't recall being consulted about that particular decision," Charlotte said as they entered the building lobby. "Isn't it customary to actually break up with someone rather than just ignoring them until they go away?" Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression tortured. "Charlotte, please, don't make this harder than it has to be." "Harder for who?" Charlotte stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. For you? For David? Or for me, the person whose life you've decided to rearrange without her permission? For everyone, Alexander said quietly. Your brother is right, Charlotte. This was a mistake from the beginning. The words hit her like a physical blow, but Charlotte forced herself to stand straighter. So everything we shared was a mistake. Every kiss, every laugh, every moment when you told me you loved me. Alexander's control cracked visibly. Don't, he said roughly. Don't use what we had against me. Then don't pretend it meant nothing. Charlotte's voice rose slightly, drawing curious glances from other people in the lobby. Don't stand there and tell me that 3 weeks of the most perfect happiness either of us has ever experienced was just some error in judgment. It doesn't matter what it was, Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's over. Why? Charlotte demanded. Because David said so. Because he threatened to end your friendship. Because he made you choose between him and me. Alexander's silence was answer enough. You chose him, Charlotte said quietly, and for the first time her voice wavered slightly. You chose your friendship with my brother over our relationship. I chose what's best for you. Alexander's eyes were pained, but resolute. David is right, Charlotte. You're 19. You should be dating boys your own age, falling in love with someone who can give you the future you deserve. And what future is that exactly? Charlotte's anger was building again, hot and fierce. The one where I settle for some college boy who bores me to tears. The one where I spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if the man I loved had actually fought for me. The one where you don't wake up in 5 years and realize you wasted your youth on a man who was too old for you from the beginning. Alexander's voice was getting rougher, more desperate. The one where you get to experience normal relationships with people your own age, where you get to make mistakes and learn and grow without some older man trying to control every aspect of your life. Is that what you think you were doing? Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. Controlling me? Wasn't I? Alexander's voice was bitter. I was the one with all the money, all the experience, all the power in the relationship. You were a 19-year-old college student who'd never been in love before. How is that not a fundamental imbalance? Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. When she spoke, her voice was steady and sure. You want to know what I learned in our relationship, Alexander? I learned what it feels like to be cherished. I learned what it's like to have someone put my needs before their own desires. I learned that love isn't about power or control. It's about partnership and respect and choosing each other every single day. Alexander's expression crumbled slightly. Charlotte, you taught me what real love looks like, she continued relentlessly. And now you're teaching me what cowardice looks like too. The accusation hung between them like a slap. Alexander's face went pale, then flushed with anger. Cowardice? His voice was dangerously quiet. What else would you call this? Charlotte gestured between them. You're throwing away the best thing that ever happened to either of us because you're afraid of what other people might think. You're letting David make decisions about my life because it's easier than standing up and fighting for what we have. I'm protecting you. You're protecting yourself. Charlotte's voice finally broke, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. You're protecting yourself from having to deal with the complications, from having to weather the disapproval, from having to work for something that's actually worth having. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something raw and desperate flickering in his expression. For a second, Charlotte thought he might actually give in, might actually fight for them. Instead, he stepped back, his expression shuttering closed again. I'm sorry, Charlotte, he said quietly, but this is how it has to be. Charlotte watched him walk toward the elevators, her heart breaking and reforming with each step he took away from her. But she wasn't done fighting yet. Alexander, she called out, her voice carrying across the marble lobby. When you're lying alone in your perfect penthouse tonight, thinking about what we could have had, I want you to remember something. He paused, but didn't turn around. I'm not giving up on us, Charlotte said clearly, loudly enough that several other people in the lobby turned to stare. I'm going to keep fighting for this, for us, until you remember that love is supposed to be worth fighting for, and when you finally come to your senses, I'll be waiting. Alexander's shoulders tensed, but he didn't respond. He stepped into the elevator without looking back. leaving Charlotte standing alone in the busy lobby, with tears streaming down her cheeks, and her heart shattered into a million pieces. But beneath the pain, beneath the devastation, there was still that stubborn flame of determination burning bright. Alexander Blackwood might think he was protecting her by pushing her away, but Charlotte Hayes had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. As she walked back out into the crisp October morning, Charlotte made herself a promise. She would find a way to make Alexander see reason. She would find a way to make David understand. And somehow, someway, she would find a way to get her happily ever after, even if she had to fight both Blackwood men to get it. 2 weeks of radio silence from Alexander had taught Charlotte several important lessons about heartbreak. First, that the poets were right. It actually did feel like a physical ache in her chest. Second, that ice cream for breakfast was a perfectly acceptable coping mechanism when one's world had imploded. And third, that desperate times called for measures so desperate they bordered on insane. Which was why Charlotte found herself standing outside Jake Morrison's fraternity house on a Friday night, wearing a dress that was entirely too short and a smile that was entirely too bright. "Charlotte!" Jake's face lit up when he opened the door, his sandy hair slightly mussed and his cheeks flushed from the party going on behind him. "I can't believe you came, and you look... wow." "Thanks," Charlotte said, accepting the red Solo cup he handed her and trying not to wince at whatever toxic combination of alcohol was inside it. "I decided I needed to get out more, meet new people, have some fun." It was partially true. She did need a distraction from the Alexander-shaped hole in her life, but the real reason she was here had nothing to do with fun and everything to do with the carefully orchestrated plan she'd spent the last 3 days developing. Phase 1. Make Alexander jealous enough to realize what he was losing. Phase 2. Force him to confront his feelings by seeing her with someone else. Phase 3. Dramatic reconciliation and happily ever after. It was a terrible plan. Charlotte knew that. It was manipulative and unfair to Jake and probably doomed to failure, but she was desperate enough to try anything at this point. The party was exactly what she'd expected. Loud music, sticky floors, and college students drinking too much while pretending to have more fun than they actually were. Charlotte let Jake introduce her to his fraternity brothers, laughed at their jokes, and allowed herself to be drawn into a game of beer pong that she was spectacularly bad at. "You're really terrible at this," Jake laughed as Charlotte's ball sailed wide of the cups for the 5th time in a row. "I'm terrible at most things involving hand-eye coordination," Charlotte admitted with a self-deprecating grin. "You should see me try to parallel park." "I'd love to," Jake said, his eyes warm as they met hers. "Maybe I could give you some lessons sometime." Charlotte felt a pang of guilt at the hopeful look in Jake's eyes. He was such a sweet guy, funny and kind and exactly the sort of person she should probably be interested in. The fact that he did absolutely nothing for her pulse was entirely unfair to both of them. "That sounds nice," she said anyway, because the whole point of this exercise was to appear available and happy. They played 2 more rounds before Charlotte excused herself to use the bathroom, pulling out her phone to execute the next phase of her plan. She took several photos of herself at the party, laughing with Jake's friends, posing with a group of girls she'd just met, looking carefree and radiant in a way that was only partially fake. Then she posted them to her Instagram story, with captions designed to suggest she was having the time of her life, finally getting back out there. And, "Sometimes the best nights are the ones you don't plan." Charlotte stared at her phone screen, knowing that Alexander would see the posts. He still followed her on social media, even if he wasn't speaking to her in real life. She wondered what he would think when he saw her surrounded by college boys, looking like she'd moved on completely from their relationship. Part of her hoped it would drive him crazy with jealousy. Another part of her hoped he'd realize she was fine without him and leave her alone to nurse her broken heart in peace. "There you are." Jake appeared beside her as she emerged from the bathroom, sliding his arm around her waist in a gesture that was friendly but unmistakably possessive. "I was starting to think you'd escaped out a window or something." "Just needed some air," Charlotte lied, leaning into his embrace because it felt nice to be wanted, even if it wasn't by the right person. "This is fun, Jake. Thanks for inviting me." "Thanks for coming." Jake's voice was soft, intimate in a way that made Charlotte's chest tighten with guilt. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me after our coffee date." I was dealing with some personal stuff, Charlotte said, which was true enough, but I'm ready to put all that behind me now. Jake's smile could have powered the entire fraternity house. I'm really glad to hear that. They spent the next hour dancing to music that was too loud and too bass-heavy. Jake's hands respectful but warm on her waist as they swayed together. Charlotte tried to lose herself in the moment, to pretend she was just a normal 19-year-old having fun at a college party with a cute boy who liked her. But every few minutes, her mind would wander to Alexander. Was he at home in his penthouse, seeing her Instagram posts and wondering who the sandy-haired boy with his arms around her was? Was he regretting his decision to push her away? Or was he relieved that she seemed to be moving on without him? Want to get some fresh air? Jake suggested when the music became overwhelmingly loud. There's a balcony upstairs that overlooks the quad. Charlotte nodded, letting him lead her through the crowd and up the stairs to a quieter part of the house. The balcony was blissfully cool after the heated atmosphere of the party, and Charlotte took a deep breath of the crisp October air. Better? Jake asked, moving to stand beside her at the railing. Much. Charlotte looked out over the campus, lit up by streetlights and dotted with students walking between dormitories. It was peaceful, beautiful even, and for a moment she could almost forget about the complicated mess her life had become. Charlotte, Jake said quietly, and something in his tone made her turn to look at him. I know this might be moving fast, but I really like you. Really like you. Charlotte's heart sank. She could see where this conversation was heading, and she suddenly realized how unfair she was being to this sweet, genuine boy, who deserved so much better than being used as a pawn in her desperate attempt to win back another man. Jake, I know you said you were dealing with some personal stuff, he continued, stepping closer, and I don't want to pressure you or anything, but I was hoping maybe we could make this official, actually date each other. The hopeful vulnerability in his expression made Charlotte want to cry. Jake Morrison was exactly the kind of boy her brother would approve of, exactly the kind of age-appropriate relationship David wanted her to have. He was sweet and uncomplicated, and ready to offer her his heart with no games, no drama, no impossible complications, and she felt absolutely nothing for him beyond mild affection. Jake, she said gently, you're really wonderful. Any girl would be lucky to date you. But not you, Jake said, his face falling as he read her expression correctly. It's not about you, Charlotte said quickly. It's about me. I'm not over someone else yet. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice was kind but sad. The guy from before? The one you said was dealing with personal stuff with? Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. Must have been pretty serious, Jake said quietly. It was, Charlotte whispered. It is. I'm sorry, Jake. I didn't mean to lead you on. I just thought maybe if I tried hard enough, I could make myself feel something different. Jake gave her a rueful smile. And how's that working out for you? Terribly, Charlotte admitted with a shaky laugh. Want to talk about it? Jake offered gently. Sometimes it helps to get an outside perspective. Charlotte considered it for a moment. Jake was sweet and uncomplicated, and had no stake in her romantic drama. Maybe talking to someone with no preconceived notions about her situation would actually help. He's older, she said finally, significantly older, and my brother hates the idea of us together. How much older? Jake asked, settling against the balcony railing beside her. 13 years. Jake whistled low. That's substantial. I know. Everyone keeps telling me it's too much, that I'm too young, that I don't know what I want. Charlotte's voice grew stronger as she spoke. But I do know what I want, Jake. I know exactly what I want, and it's him. But he ended things because of your brother? Charlotte nodded miserably. He thinks he's protecting me. He thinks I'll be better off with someone my own age, someone like... She gestured vaguely at Jake. Someone like me, Jake finished with a wry smile. Well, thanks for that ego boost. You know what I mean, Charlotte said, bumping his shoulder gently. Someone uncomplicated, someone safe. And what do you think? Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the campus where groups of students were laughing and talking and living their uncomplicated college lives. I think love isn't supposed to be safe, she said finally. I think it's supposed to be terrifying and overwhelming and worth fighting for. And I think the people who love me are so busy trying to protect me that they're protecting me right out of the best thing that ever happened to me. Jake nodded thoughtfully. So what are you going to do about it? Charlotte turned to look at him, this sweet boy who was offering her friendship and perspective instead of pushing his own agenda. I'm going to fight harder, she said with growing conviction. I'm going to make him remember what we had together, and I'm going to prove to everyone, including him, that some things are worth the risk. Jake smiled, and for the first time all evening, it reached his eyes completely. Now that sounds like a plan worth having. As they walked back downstairs together, Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest. She'd been going about this all wrong, trying to make Alexander jealous, trying to manipulate him into coming back to her. But manipulation wasn't love, and games weren't the foundation of a real relationship. If she wanted Alexander back, she was going to have to be honest, vulnerable, real, and she was going to have to be willing to risk everything, including her heart, to get him back. The question was, did she have the courage to put herself on the line one more time? Looking out at the campus full of people living their safe, predictable lives, Charlotte realized she already knew the answer. Charlotte had never broken into someone's office before, but she discovered it was surprisingly easy when you were desperate enough and had a friend whose older sister worked as a security guard in Alexander's building. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and careful planning had led to this moment. Standing outside Alexander's corner office at 9 p.m. on a Thursday night, armed with nothing but determination and the spare keycard Jessica had borrowed from the security desk. The office was dark, illuminated only by the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Charlotte had been counting on Alexander working late. He always worked late when he was stressed or upset, and according to the building's night security guard, who Jessica had flirted information out of, Mr. Blackwood had been staying until nearly midnight every night for the past 3 weeks. Charlotte settled into the leather chair across from Alexander's desk and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was either the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most spectacularly stupid, and she wouldn't know which until Alexander walked through that door. At 9:43, she heard his distinctive footsteps in the hallway outside. Charlotte straightened in her chair, smoothing down the emerald green dress she'd chosen specifically because Alexander had once told her it made her eyes look like jewels. The door opened, and Alexander stepped inside, loosening his tie with one hand while reaching for the light switch with the other. When the lights flickered on and he saw her sitting there, he froze completely. "Hello, Alexander," Charlotte said quietly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Alexander stood silhouetted in the doorway, his dark suit immaculate despite the late hour, his expressions cycling through shock, panic, and something that looked dangerously like relief. "How did you get in here?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I have my ways." Charlotte folded her hands in her lap, projecting a calm she didn't feel. "We need to talk." "No, we don't." Alexander stepped fully into the office, but didn't close the door. An escape route, Charlotte realized. "We said everything that needed to be said 3 weeks ago." "You said everything you thought needed to be said," Charlotte corrected. "I never got a chance to respond." Alexander moved behind his desk, putting the large piece of furniture between them like a barrier. "Charlotte, this is inappropriate. You can't just break into my office." "Why not?" Charlotte stood up, smoothing her dress with deliberate slowness. "You won't take my calls. You've banned me from your building. You ignore my texts. What choice did you leave me?" "The choice to accept that this is over and move on with your life." Alexander's voice was strained, and Charlotte noticed that he was gripping the edge of his desk hard enough to make his knuckles white. "Like you've moved on?" Charlotte asked, tilting her head to study his face. "Is that why you look like you haven't slept in weeks? Why your assistant told Jessica you've been impossible to work with lately? Why you've been staying in this office until midnight every night instead of going home?" Alexander's jaw clenched. "My work habits are none of your concern." "Everything about you is my concern," Charlotte said simply. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them, and Charlotte watched Alexander's carefully maintained composure crack just slightly. "Charlotte, I love you," she repeated, stepping around the desk toward him. "I love the way you hum unconsciously when you're cooking. I love that you read 3 different newspapers every morning, because you like to get multiple perspectives on the news. I love that you remember how I take my coffee, and that you always make sure I eat when I'm stressed about exams." Alexander backed away from her approach, but he was running out of space. "Stop. I love that you carried me upstairs when I was sick and took care of me all night without asking for anything in return." Charlotte kept moving closer, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I love that you tried to protect me from your own feelings because you thought that's what was best for me. I love that you're noble and self-sacrificing and completely, utterly wrong about what I need." "I'm not wrong." Alexander's voice was desperate now. "Your brother is right, Charlotte. You deserve better than this, better than me. Better than the man who makes me laugh until my sides ache? Better than the man who holds me like I'm precious? Better than the man who looks at me like I'm his entire world?" Charlotte was close enough now to see the gold flecks in Alexander's dark eyes, close enough to smell his cologne. "Tell me, Alexander, what exactly would be better than being loved by you?" "Being loved by someone appropriate," Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Someone your own age, someone who can give you a normal relationship." "I don't want normal." The words burst out of Charlotte with more force than she'd intended. "I don't want some college boy who'll take me to keg parties and think he's being romantic when he remembers my birthday. I don't want safe, predictable, age-appropriate love, Alexander. I want you." Alexander stared at her, his control visibly fraying. "You don't understand what you're asking for. Then explain it to me." Charlotte reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. "Tell me what I don't understand." Alexander closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into it involuntarily before catching himself and pulling away. "I understand that loving you means dealing with people who'll judge us," Charlotte continued relentlessly. "I understand that it means navigating the complications of our age difference and our different life stages. I understand that it means fighting for us every single day against people who think they know what's best for me." She paused, waiting until Alexander opened his eyes to meet hers. "And I understand that none of that matters if we love each other enough to make it work. Your brother will have to accept that I'm not his little girl anymore," Charlotte finished firmly. "David raised me to be strong and independent and capable of making my own decisions. He doesn't get to take that back just because he doesn't like the decision I'm making." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if looking for some sign that she might change her mind. "I've missed you," he admitted quietly, his voice broken. "God, Charlotte, I've missed you so much I can barely breathe." Charlotte's heart soared. "Then why are we doing this? Why are we standing here pretending we don't belong together when we both know we do?" "Because I'm terrified," Alexander said with raw honesty. "I'm terrified that your brother is right, that I'll hurt you somehow. I'm terrified that people will look at us and see something sordid instead of something beautiful. I'm terrified that you'll wake up in 5 years and realize you wasted your youth on me." Charlotte stepped closer, close enough that she was almost pressed against his chest. "And I'm terrified that we're going to waste the rest of our lives being apart because you're too afraid to fight for us," she whispered. "I'm terrified that I'll spend forever wondering what could have been if the man I love had just been brave enough to love me back." Alexander's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking over her cheekbones with achingly familiar tenderness. "I do love you back," he said roughly. "More than I've ever loved anything in my life. That's the problem." "That's not a problem," Charlotte whispered, rising up on her tiptoes to bring their faces closer together. "That's the solution." For a moment, they stood frozen like that, their faces inches apart, their breathing ragged. Charlotte could see the war raging in Alexander's dark eyes, duty versus desire, fear versus love. Then, Alexander's control, finally, completely shattered. He crushed his mouth to hers with a desperate hunger that took Charlotte's breath away. This wasn't like their previous kisses, soft and careful and restrained. This was the kiss of a man who had been denying himself for too long, who had finally reached his breaking point. Charlotte melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as she kissed him back with equal desperation. 3 weeks of separation, 3 weeks of heartbreak and longing poured into that kiss. Alexander's hands tangled in her hair, holding her exactly where he wanted her, as he explored her mouth with a thoroughness that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "This is crazy," he murmured. "Completely," Charlotte agreed breathlessly. Your brother is going to kill me. Probably. Alexander pulled back to look at her, his expression intense. I can't promise this will be easy, Charlotte. There are going to be challenges we haven't even thought of yet. People are going to talk, judge, disapprove. I know. Charlotte cupped his face in her hands, her eyes steady on his. And I don't care. As long as I have you, I can handle anything else. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and Charlotte saw the exact second when he made his decision, when he finally chose love over fear. Then we do this together, he said quietly. All of it. The good, the bad, the complicated, the impossible. We face it as a team. As a team, Charlotte agreed, her heart soaring with joy and relief and pure, overwhelming love. Alexander kissed her again, softer this time but no less meaningful. And as Charlotte lost herself in the warmth of his embrace, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The fight for their love was far from over, but they had each other now, and that was everything. 3 months later, Charlotte stood in front of her bathroom mirror on a crisp February morning, staring at her reflection with a mixture of excitement and absolute terror. Tonight was the night. After weeks of careful planning and gentle persuasion, David had finally agreed to have dinner with her and Alexander. Not because he'd softened his position, but because Charlotte had played her trump card. She'd told him she was moving in with Alexander, whether he approved or not, and he could either be part of her life or watch from the sidelines. The ultimatum had worked, but Charlotte knew tonight would determine whether she'd won the war or simply delayed the inevitable explosion. "So you're going to wear a hole in that dress if you keep fidgeting," Alexander said from the bedroom doorway, his voice amused but gentle. Charlotte turned to find him leaning against the frame, devastatingly handsome in a navy sweater and dark jeans, casual enough to seem approachable, sophisticated enough to remind David that he wasn't some college boy. They'd debated his outfit for 20 minutes, weighing the psychological impact of every choice. "I can't help it," Charlotte admitted, smoothing down the soft cashmere dress they'd chosen, because it was elegant but not trying too hard. "I feel like we're going into battle." "We are, in a way." Alexander stepped into the bathroom and wrapped his arms around her from behind, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "But we're going into it together." Charlotte leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. The past 3 months had been challenging in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, not because of their relationship. That had been nothing but joy and discovery and deepening love. But the outside world had proven less welcoming than she'd hoped. Some of her classmates had been supportive. Others had been judgmental in ways that ranged from subtle to cruel. Charlotte had learned to ignore the whispers that followed her across campus, had developed a thick skin against the assumptions people made about her relationship with Alexander. But it hadn't been easy. What had surprised her was how much the criticism affected Alexander. She'd expected him to be immune to other people's opinions, but watching him tense every time someone made a snide comment about cradle robbing or gold diggers had broken her heart in ways she hadn't prepared for. "Maybe we should have done this sooner," Charlotte said quietly, "given David more time to adjust to the idea." "We gave him 3 months," Alexander pointed out, "and besides, you needed time to be sure this was what you really wanted." Charlotte turned in his arms to face him properly. "I was sure the first time you kissed me." "You were 19 and infatuated," Alexander said with a gentle smile. "Now you're 20 and, hopefully, still sure, but for better reasons." "I'm sure because I know you now," Charlotte said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "I know how you take your coffee and how you laugh at terrible movies. I know that you're grumpy in the morning until you've read the financial pages, and that you hum when you cook, and that you worry about everyone you care about sometimes to the point of distraction." Alexander's expression softened. "And those are good enough reasons." "Those are perfect reasons," Charlotte said firmly. "Plus, I love the way you kiss me like I'm air, and you've been holding your breath your whole life." Alexander's answering smile was worth every difficult moment they'd endured. He leaned down to capture her lips in a kiss that was both tender and possessive, a reminder of everything they'd fought for and everything they stood to lose if tonight went badly. When they broke apart, Charlotte felt steadier, more centered. Whatever happened with David tonight, she and Alexander were solid. They were real. They were worth fighting for. "Ready?" Alexander asked, offering her his arm. Ready, Charlotte said, taking it with more confidence than she felt. The restaurant was neutral territory, an upscale Italian place that wasn't too formal but wasn't casual either, somewhere that would feel comfortable for all of them. David was already seated at their table when they arrived, looking every inch the successful lawyer in his perfectly tailored suit and crisp white shirt. Charlotte's heart clenched at the sight of him. She'd missed her brother desperately over the past few months, missed their easy conversations and his terrible jokes, and the way he'd always been her fiercest protector. Seeing him now, looking older and more tired than she remembered, made her realize how much this situation had cost him too. David, she said softly as they approached the table. Charlotte. David stood to greet her, and for a moment Charlotte thought he might actually hug her. Instead, he gave her a formal kiss on the cheek, before turning to Alexander with a nod that was polite but decidedly cool. Alexander. David. Alexander's voice was equally formal. Thank you for agreeing to this dinner. My sister can be very persuasive when she wants something, David said, and Charlotte couldn't tell if it was meant as a compliment or criticism. The first 20 minutes of dinner were painfully awkward. They made stilted conversation about David's work, about Charlotte's classes, about the weather, anything except the elephant in the room that had brought them all together. Charlotte watched her brother and the man she loved circle each other with the wary politeness of diplomats negotiating a ceasefire, and her heart ached for all of them. Finally, as the waiter cleared their appetizer plates, David set down his wineglass and looked directly at Alexander. So, he said with deceptive calm, how exactly do you justify this? Charlotte's breath caught, but Alexander met David's gaze steadily. I don't, he said quietly. I can't justify falling in love with your sister, David. It happened despite my best efforts to prevent it, despite knowing how you'd feel about it, despite understanding all the reasons it's complicated. Complicated, David repeated flatly. That's one word for it. David, Charlotte began, but Alexander placed a gentle hand on her arm. Let me answer this, he said softly, then turned back to David. You asked me to look out for Charlotte, to protect her, keep her safe, make sure she was okay while you were traveling, and somewhere in the process of doing that I fell in love with her. So you decided to seduce her instead? Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. I decided to stay away from her. I tried to maintain appropriate boundaries, to treat her like nothing more than my best friend's little sister. But Charlotte had other ideas. Don't you dare blame this on her. I'm not blaming anyone, Alexander said firmly. I'm telling you the truth. Your sister pursued me, David, relentlessly, with a determination that would have impressed Napoleon. Charlotte felt her cheeks flush, but she lifted her chin defiantly when David turned to stare at her. Is that true? He asked. Absolutely, Charlotte said without shame. I wanted him from the moment I met him. I spent months trying to get his attention, creating excuses to see him, basically throwing myself at him until he finally gave in. David rubbed his forehead wearily. Charlotte, that's not something to be proud of. Yes, it is, Charlotte said firmly. It's something to be very proud of. I saw what I wanted, who I wanted, and I went after him. You raised me to be strong and determined, and to fight for what I believe in. Well, I believe in Alexander, I believe in us. You're 20 years old, David said quietly. You don't know what you want yet. I'm 20 years old, not 12, Charlotte shot back, her patience finally fraying. I'm old enough to vote, to serve in the military, to make legal decisions about my own life. I'm certainly old enough to decide who I want to love. Love, David scoffed. You think this is love? Charlotte, you have no idea what a real relationship looks like. This man is 13 years older than you. He has more money than you could spend in a lifetime. He could control every aspect of your life if he wanted to. But he doesn't, Charlotte interrupted. That's what you don't understand, David. Alexander doesn't try to control me. He supports me, encourages me, respects my opinions and my choices. He's never once tried to make me feel small or young or incapable. Unlike some people, Alexander added quietly, and Charlotte saw David flinch. I'm trying to protect her, David said defensively. From what? Alexander asked. From being loved? From being cherished? From having someone who would do anything to make her happy? From making a mistake she'll regret for the rest of her life. Like the mistake you made when you gave up everything to raise me? Charlotte asked softly. David went very still. That's not the same thing, isn't it? Charlotte leaned forward, her eyes intense on her brother's face. You were 22 when Mum and Dad died. You could have let me go into foster care, could have continued with your own life, dated people your own age, had a normal young adult experience. Instead, you chose love. You chose family. You chose to fight for something that mattered more than what was easy or appropriate. That was different. How? Charlotte demanded. How is my choice to love Alexander different from your choice to love me? David was quiet for a long moment, his face cycling through several emotions. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. Because I was afraid of losing you, he admitted quietly. You were all I had left of our family. The thought of someone taking you away from me, of you not needing me anymore. Charlotte felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Oh, David, you're never going to lose me, and I'm always going to need you just differently than I did when I was 16. She talks about you constantly, Alexander said quietly, about how grateful she is for everything you've done for her, how much she loves you, how much she wants your approval. Hurting you is the last thing either of us wants to do. David looked between them, his expression troubled. But you're going to do it anyway. We're going to love each other, Charlotte said simply. Whether you approve or not, but I'd rather do it with your blessing than without it. David was quiet for so long that Charlotte began to worry he might simply get up and leave. Finally, he turned to Alexander. If you hurt her, he said quietly, if you break her heart or take advantage of her trust or make her feel like she's not good enough, I will destroy you. Professionally, personally, in every way that matters. I understand, Alexander said steadily. And if you decide in 5 years that you want someone more mature, more sophisticated, more age-appropriate, and you break up with her to go find that person, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. David, Charlotte started to protest, but Alexander squeezed her hand gently. I understand that too, he said, and I can live with those conditions because I have no intention of letting Charlotte go. Ever. David studied Alexander's face intently, as if trying to read the truth in his expression. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy something in him, because his shoulders relaxed slightly. She's the most important person in my world, David said quietly. She's brilliant and beautiful, and deserves everything good that life has to offer. I know, Alexander said simply, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure she gets it. David nodded slowly, then turned to Charlotte. And you? Are you really sure about this? Because once I give my blessing, I can't take it back. I won't be able to protect you from the consequences of this choice. Charlotte looked at Alexander, this man who had turned her world upside down, who had challenged her and cherished her and loved her with an intensity that still took her breath away. Then she looked back at her brother, this man who had sacrificed everything to give her a chance at happiness. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said quietly. I love him, David. Really, truly, completely love him. And he loves me the same way. David sighed deeply, the sound of a man accepting the inevitable. Then I guess I'd better learn to love him too. The relief that flooded through Charlotte was so intense, she nearly started crying right there in the restaurant. Instead, she reached across the table to squeeze her brother's hand. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, David said wryly. Wait until I give him the shovel talk over dessert. Despite everything, Charlotte laughed. I love you, David. I love you too, kiddo, David said softly. Then, turning to Alexander with the expression that was still wary but no longer hostile, he added, Welcome to the family, I suppose. Try not to make me regret this. Alexander smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn all evening. I'll do my best. As the waiter brought their entrees and the conversation turned to lighter topics, Charlotte felt something settle into place inside her chest. It wasn't going to be easy. There would still be challenges, still be people who disapproved, still be moments when the age difference between her and Alexander created complications, but they had each other now, and they had David's blessing, grudging though it might be. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 2 years later, Charlotte stood at the back of Columbia University's graduation ceremony, her cap slightly askew and her gown wrinkled from excited hugging, scanning the sea of proud families for 2 familiar faces. The ceremony had been beautiful, emotional, and interminably long, but now that it was over, all she wanted was to find the men who meant everything to her. She spotted David first, impossible to miss in his perfectly tailored suit, holding a bouquet of pink roses that she knew he'd chosen because they were her favorite. His face was beaming with pride, and when their eyes met across the crowd, he raised the flowers in a triumphant salute that made her laugh despite the tears threatening to spill over. But it was the man standing next to David who made her heart stop completely. Alexander was down on one knee in the middle of the crowded graduation lawn, a small velvet box in his hands, and an expression of such tender love on his face that Charlotte forgot how to breathe. Around them, other graduates and families had noticed the scene unfolding, and a circle was forming as people stopped to watch the proposal happening in their midst. Charlotte's hands flew to her mouth, her bouquet of graduation flowers falling forgotten to the grass, as she stared at the man she'd been loving more deeply with each passing day for the past 2 years. "Charlotte Hayes," Alexander called out, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn despite the noise of the celebration around them. "Would you please come here? I have something extremely important to ask you." The crowd parted to let Charlotte through, and she walked toward Alexander on unsteady legs, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching them, but unable to focus on anything except his beloved face. This was not how she'd imagined this moment. She'd pictured something private, intimate, just the two of them, but as she looked at Alexander kneeling there in front of God and everyone, she realized it was absolutely perfect. He wasn't hiding their love anymore. He was celebrating it publicly and proudly in front of anyone who cared to watch. "Alexander," Charlotte whispered when she reached him, "what are you doing?" "Something I should have done months ago," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. "Something I would have done the day I realized I couldn't live without you, if I'd been brave enough." Charlotte felt tears spill over her cheeks as Alexander opened the small velvet box to reveal the most stunning ring she'd ever seen, a perfect solitaire diamond surrounded by smaller stones that sparkled like stars in the afternoon sunlight. "Charlotte Hayes," Alexander said, his voice stronger now, projected so that everyone gathered around them could hear. "You are the bravest, most determined, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You conquered my heart with your ridiculous excuses and your terrible coffee emergencies and your absolute refusal to give up on us when everyone else thought we were crazy." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Charlotte caught sight of several of her classmates wiping away tears as they watched the scene unfold. "You taught me what real love looks like," Alexander continued, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "You taught me that some things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth choosing again and again no matter how hard it gets. You made me brave enough to stop hiding from what we have and start celebrating it." Charlotte was crying openly now, but she didn't care. Nothing existed except Alexander's voice and his love-filled eyes and the promise hanging in the air between them. "I know our love story wasn't conventional," Alexander said, his voice growing softer, more intimate despite their very public setting. "I know we've had to fight for every moment, overcome every obstacle, prove ourselves to everyone who doubted us, but I wouldn't change a single moment of it because it brought us here." He took a shaky breath, and Charlotte could see that he was fighting back tears of his own. "You called me a coward once," he said with a rueful smile. "You were right. I was too afraid to fight for us, too worried about what other people would think, too concerned about protecting you from a love that felt too big and too complicated. But you, my brave, stubborn, magnificent brat, you fought for both of us, until I remembered how to be brave too." The endearment made Charlotte laugh through her tears, remembering all the times he'd called her that with exasperation and growing affection. "So Charlotte Hayes," Alexander said, his voice clear and strong and certain, "will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were right to fight for us? Will you let me love you and cherish you and probably call you a brat when you're being particularly impossible for the next 60 or 70 years? Charlotte looked down at this incredible man who had turned her world upside down, who had loved her through every challenge and obstacle, who was now offering her everything she'd ever dreamed of and more. Around them she was dimly aware of the crowd holding its breath, waiting for her answer, but there was only one answer she could give. "Yes," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "Yes, yes, absolutely, yes." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. Then he was standing, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around as she laughed and cried and kissed him with all the love in her overflowing heart. When Alexander finally set her back on her feet, Charlotte became aware of the celebration happening around them. Her classmates were cheering, strangers were wiping away tears, and photographers were snapping pictures of what would undoubtedly become one of Columbia's most talked-about graduation day proposals. But it was David's face that caught her attention, her brother standing just a few feet away with tears streaming down his cheeks and the biggest smile she'd ever seen on his face. David knew, Charlotte asked Alexander, suddenly understanding why her brother had been so insistent that she meet them immediately after the ceremony, instead of going to the post-graduation party with her friends. "I asked his permission," Alexander said with a grin. "Seemed like the right thing to do considering our history." "And what did he say?" "He said it was about damn time," David said, stepping forward to envelop both of them in a huge hug. "He's been carrying that ring around for 3 months, waiting for the perfect moment." 3 months? Charlotte pulled back to stare at Alexander in amazement. "I wanted to wait until you graduated," Alexander explained, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I wanted you to finish this chapter of your life before we started the next one together. I wanted to make sure you had your degree, your independence, your own accomplishments that had nothing to do with me." The thoughtfulness of it, the way he'd considered her feelings and her future, made Charlotte fall in love with him all over again. "Besides," Alexander added with a mischievous smile, "I figured if I was going to propose to you in front of hundreds of people, I might as well make it memorable." "Memorable?" Charlotte repeated with a laugh. "Is that what we're calling this?" "I'm calling it perfect," Alexander said softly, pressing his forehead against hers as the celebration continued around them. "Just like everything else about loving you." 1 year later, Charlotte stood in the marble foyer of Alexander's penthouse, their penthouse now, holding a steaming mug of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and pink. At 22, she felt like a completely different person from the 19-year-old girl who had once used ridiculous excuses to visit this apartment. She was different. Marriage to Alexander had changed her in ways she was still discovering, made her more confident, more secure in herself, more certain of her own worth and capabilities. She'd started graduate school in international business, was considering a PhD, had already been offered a position at Alexander's company that would begin after she finished her studies. Her life was everything she'd dreamed of and more. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," Alexander said from the kitchen doorway, his voice still rough with sleep and his dark hair adorably mussed. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Charlotte replied, with a smile that still made his eyes light up like Christmas morning. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Alexander admitted, crossing to wrap his arms around her from behind. "I kept thinking about something." "What something?" Charlotte leaned back against his chest, marveling as she always did at how perfectly they fit together. "Do you remember the first morning you came up here looking for coffee?" Alexander asked, pressing a soft kiss to the side of her neck. "How could I forget?" Charlotte laughed. "I was so nervous I could barely speak. You terrified me." "You terrified me too," Alexander admitted. "Standing there in your pajamas and fuzzy slippers, looking so young and innocent and absolutely beautiful. I knew right then that you were going to be trouble." "The best kind of trouble," Charlotte said, turning in his arms to face him. "The very best kind," Alexander agreed, his hands settling on her still flat stomach where their first child was just beginning to grow, a secret they'd discovered just days ago and were still marveling over. Charlotte covered his hands with hers, intertwining their fingers over the tiny new life they'd created together. "Can you believe it?" she whispered. "Everything we've built, everything we have." "Sometimes I think I'm dreaming," Alexander admitted softly, "that I'll wake up and you'll just be David's little sister again, too young and too good for me to even think about touching." "Well, you'd better not wake up," Charlotte said firmly. "Because I have about 60 more years of loving you planned, and I'd hate for you to miss it." Alexander's answering smile was radiant, full of joy and love and absolute certainty. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted like coffee and morning sunshine, and happily ever after. Outside the penthouse windows, New York City was waking up to another day. But inside their perfect sanctuary, Charlotte and Alexander were living their own fairy tale, one that had started with manufactured emergencies and stubborn determination and had grown into something beautiful and lasting and real. Some love stories begin with chance meetings or mutual friends or dating apps. Theirs had begun with a 19-year-old girl who knew what she wanted and a 32-year-old man who tried desperately to resist her. It had been the most perfectly imperfect beginning to the most perfectly perfect love story either of them could have imagined. And as Charlotte looked at her husband, this man who had loved her through every challenge, every doubt, every moment of growth and change, she knew their story was just beginning. The best was yet to come. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.